Greetings, friends. Welcome back to the adventure. I am, of course, your host, Zach Pieper, the lead adventurer, and today I have something for you that is particularly relevant and important in the current climate, and that is a debate about the Ukraine war and the U.S. involvement therein. Now, as for the participants, Rob Knorr is a debater over on Twitch. He's got collegiate debate background. And Twisted Aviator, one of my Twitch mods, is a former Marine pilot, flew combat missions. He's got a degree in physics, and he attended the Naval College. So both of these gentlemen are intelligent and knowledgeable in the political arena, and it was a great conversation. I tried and sometimes failed to be an impartial moderator in the debate, and I made some mistakes in that regard. It was also my first time moderating any kind of serious actual debate. So in the future, I'm going to try to keep these a little bit shorter. I'm going to try to keep it probably down to the 90-minute range, maybe 1 hour range. And I am also going to try to be a little bit better about being impartial and unbiased, if that's even possible. But for now, this is the debate. I appreciate you being here. Share this around with your friends, and stay free. Welcome to the adventure. So, welcome to the first Adventurous debate, everyone. I am your host, the lead adventurer, Zach Pieper. With me is my delightful wife, Caitlin.
Hello.
Up in the left-hand corner, we have Rob Knorr, well-known debate bro over in the Twitchosphere. And right above me, we have one of my mods and a friend, Twisted Aviator. Gentlemen, I'd like to start the debate. Cyber, thank you very much for the follow. Welcome to the adventure. Gentlemen, I would like to just start this off with both of you giving a brief intro. Anything that's, any relevant experience, education, anything you want to be relevant and disclosed for the debate.
Okay, I could go first if you want. I think, weirdly enough, the only experience that I consider myself a populist conservative. I was a pretty good collegiate debater. I don't consider myself an expert in anything. I think that I just have a way of speaking that's sometimes effective and a way of thinking of things that's sort of a common sense type approach. I think my expertise when it comes to these foreign policy decisions isn't that I'm somehow a member of foreign policy or was involved in the military or anything like that. It's that my entire life I have watched the corruption of our foreign policy in this country, and I've been remarkably accurate, I think, on things that I've predicted on a varying amount of foreign policy frameworks. So, we'll see. The Ukraine situations, I enjoy these conversations because it's strange bedfellows. You see people on the left and the right that are for sending money to Ukraine and people on the left and the right that are against it. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation. So
it is interesting, the lines that this particular issue has drawn. It's been very interesting. It's almost a unique issue, like, in that way. It it really has been interesting. Twisted.
Yeah, is maybe my mic a little better?
Not really.
No? Son of a bitch.
it's a little quieter, but the same.
A little quieter?
Yeah.
What about now? I don't know.
It'll be all right.
Anyway,
we'll make it work.
So
yeah.
I'm Twisted Aviator. I don't think the physics degree has anything to do with what we're talking about tonight, but I did spend 20 years in the Marine Corps as a Marine aviator flying the 88B Harrier. Attended various schools, including U.S.A. Naval War College while I was in. So there we have it.
Alrighty. And just so everyone is perfectly clear, the debate tonight is about the legitimacy of the Ukraine war, its true motivations, and whether or not the U.S. should or should not be present, and to what degree we should be present. I do not have any preference on which one of you starts laying out your position. If either one of you feels like you want to go first, that's fine. And as questions pop up from the chat, we may occasionally stop for a question from the chat. I have some questions that I'm going to save for more towards the end after you've both kind of said your piece. And then we'll probably wrap up at, whatever course that takes.
Sounds good. Oh, Twisted, I think you're
You're echoing, Twisted.
you're echoing. Our audio's coming through your end. Do I win by default if he's having this many tech problems?
Well, I don't know if you win by default, but I am gonna slap him when I meet him in real life eventually.
There you go.
He'll be able
Are
to
you
kick
good?
my ass, but
Are
I'll
you
still
good
do
now,
it.
Twisted? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I think I'm good.
Okay. No problem. It's up to you. If you want to start, you can, or I can. It doesn't matter to me.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I'll try to keep it within like 3 minutes just here for the opening. I think my position is I am a nationalist, unabashedly. I believe the government of this country should work solely for the interest of the people of this country. I don't care your race, I don't care your creed, I don't care your religion. If you are a legitimate citizen of this country, then this government is supposed to work for you. I don't believe that our government should be going out intentionally causing harms, like stealing from people to benefit us. But other than that, do no harm philosophy when at all possible, they should be looking out for our own interests. So my default is that these foreign policy decisions to send billions upon billions of dollars, or to send boots on the ground, or to send weapons, etc., are usually something that's done at the expense of things that we could be doing to benefit the people of this country. In addition, we have seen over and over again that every time these sorts of policies have been instituted in my lifeline, they have led to misery, which has led to the enrichment of people in the military industrial complex and the people they lobby for in our Washington class and other institutions. And it's led to terrible situations in the country that we are allegedly helping, when we'll eventually leave them hanging high and dry, like Libya, like Vietnam, like Afghanistan, and a litany of other countries, Iraq, that we could talk about. I don't know exactly what the motivation is. I have some feelings that we could talk about, but I do know this. The motivations for the United States government being involved in Ukraine has nothing to do with being altruistic. If that was the case, if they really were concerned about sovereignty and countries that invade it, then we would not have boots on the ground in places like Syria and bombing Syria, violating their sovereignty. We also would have done the same in Libya and a litany of other places. So there are a bunch of possibilities maybe we could get into as to what's really going on here, but it's about enriching themselves, enriching this globalist system that they seek to achieve. And the losers of this are always the people on the ground in places like Ukraine and the average citizens of the United States. I keep talking if you want. Go ahead.
I guess I'll go. I didn't know Zach was going to moderate. And okay.
No,
Anyway,
if he, I want to be as uninvolved as possible. My job is purely to be the link between you guys in the chat and make sure it stays civil.
Okay.
Nerds.
One thing I'd like to say is I agree with you that our government should be doing things that are 100% for the American people. However, defending Ukraine is for the American people. The reason it has nothing to do with sovereignty, has nothing to do with money making, all of that. All right, okay, it might have a little bit to do with that. Okay, I'll admit that. Military, the industry makes money, right? I mean, that's a given. However, the real reason is that we can't go to war with Russia. And when I say that, the reason that Russia invaded Ukraine has nothing to do with the Donbass, has nothing to do with Russian-speaking people, has everything to do with geographic choke points that once were part of the Soviet Union, that no longer are part of Greater Russia. Russia has been invaded many times, although we all know that NATO is a defensive alliance. To Russia, it's a threat. So Putin seems to think that NATO is going to invade Russia. There are geographic choke points that exist within various regions of Russia, as well as some of the former Soviet bloc locations, such as Kazakhstan, Crimea, interestingly enough, Georgia, interestingly enough. Now, the two remaining of the six that Russia does not control exist within the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and Estonia. If we do not stop Russia here, in Ukraine, we will be fighting Russia down the line in Eastern Europe for those geographic choke points. We have a treaty with those countries through NATO, and that is a war we cannot fight. I mean, this is going to sound cold and heartless, but you know what? I'd rather we funnel money to Ukrainians and let Ukrainians die fighting Russia than have Americans die fighting Russia. And that's my.
Okay. You want to just we could just get into open conversation. Are you aware of a geopolitical strategist by the name of Peter Zan?
I am very aware of him.
I've heard Peter Zan talk about this too. The problem with what Peter Zan says, I don't necessarily disagree with this idea that Russia feels like they have to have these choke points. Geographically, I think that makes sense. Where Zan's thinking of this goes wrong, and sort of what you're saying is, if it's true that they'll stop at nothing to get these choke points, and that they feel that their time's running out because Zan says, when it comes to their birth rates and things like this is the last generation that they'll have enough soldiers to fight something like this. And if we have boots on the ground, they would use nuclear weapons. Therefore, we have to proxy fund Ukraine to do this. Well, the two problems with that is we've just found out from the leaks today that there are boots on the ground and have been the entire time. And there's no reason that Russia wouldn't be able to see this. If Russia's so desperate that they would attack Europe, thereby triggering a NATO alliance to attack them, and they would stop at nothing, why would they not do that anyway? They're not going to allow themselves to be wiped off the face of the earth. If it comes to Putin or his people being wiped out, So I don't know. I guess my question then that I would ask you is, if come hell or high water, they're always coming for these choke points. Like, how is involving ourselves in Ukraine going to solve this situation when inevitably Russia will use their last tool on the table, nuclear weapons?
Well, I personally, and this is a personal opinion, Russia's not going to use nuclear weapons to take Ukraine, nor are they going to use nuclear weapons to take NATO territory. I think that nuclear weapons would be used in the case of Russian soil being attacked. If we put boots on the ground, theoretically, in Ukraine, like really put boots on the ground, not training, but real fighting, and we went into Russia, might Putin hit the button? Yeah. Until then, I don't think he would. He's not a stupid man. He knows that pushing the button is the end of everything, right? And there's a little bit of Putin wanting a legacy here too. And if Russia doesn't exist, there's not much of a legacy right there, right?
Okay. That's true. But let me ask you this. If it's true that if we weren't helping Ukraine, they would make their way into NATO allied countries like Poland. Let me ask you this. Do you think Russia has underperformed expectations in Ukraine?
Absolutely. If they attacked NATO, let's just say hypothetically that we decided to pull out all the stops, we went boots on the ground right now in Ukraine. I would estimate, and this is just a personal estimation based on experience, that we would push Russia out of Ukraine within a month or two. We would decimate their forces in a conventional war. Absolutely destroy them.
Wouldn't Putin know that?
Huh?
Wouldn't Putin know that? Well, okay.
I don't think he had a good idea of how much of a paper tiger his military was.
Okay, so then let's say this. Maybe we would disagree on whether or not we should have initially been funding this situation in Ukraine. But at this point, why is it worth to keep funding it? Because it's obvious, if Russia's underperformed, and you said it would take us a week to take them out, that if they did go after these choke points, which you say inevitably they would, that they would just immediately within a week get their ass handed to them. So why continue to send billions to prolong a conflict that's leading to hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dying if we could just say, you know what, we're not going to fund this anymore, and Putin, if you go further, you're just going to be wiped out immediately.
Because the Ukrainians, while they are performing incredibly well against the Russians, they would not be performing incredibly well against the Russians without our backing and material support.
Well, that might be true. But if the concern is for, as you've already agreed, for the benefit of the United States, at this point, let's say tomorrow the United States stops funding. And not only that, they would pull back the weapons that they said, you know what, we're taking these back. Now, that would be a pretty crappy thing to do to the Ukrainians, right? But if it happened, right, wouldn't Russia at this point know, well, we can't go any further? I mean, we just got our ass handed to us by Ukrainians. What chance do we have against the entire force of NATO?
Well, they may not go to battle with NATO tomorrow if we pulled out, right? They might lick their wounds, most likely would lick their wounds, try to rebuild, and in 10 years execute another attack, whether that be in Ukraine or in NATO.
If I may mute for just a second, it's not about winning. It's about sending a message.
Grumple. Not in the middle of this, please, brother.
Please continue.
But even if that was true, like this is because the problem is all of this is sort of cyclical, right? So if the argument is, well, we have to fight them now in Ukraine because even though we now know that they can't get into NATO, they can't get into the NATO countries, right? They're just not strong enough. We still have to continue fighting because if we stopped funding it, then Russia would lick their wounds and 10 years from now they would try again. Well, why isn't that the status quo? If we keep funding Ukraine, even if until Russia pulls out of Ukraine, aren't they just going to lick their wounds and come back 10 years from now? Then we'll have to fund Ukraine all over again and have perpetual war in the region?
No, because the Russians, if they continue to fight this war, they're going to lose manpower to the point where they cannot reconstitute themselves even as a regional power. Again, we're going to go back to what, I happen to agree with Zion on this. Their demographics are not going to allow that, especially since they are decimating their breeding age men with this war. They're not going to be able to reconstitute their power, even as a regional power, for generations.
Okay, and let's go back to your rationale for why they invaded, which was these choke points. Why are they so concerned with getting these choke points? It's to defend their country, correct?
Yeah, in Putin's mind, yes, or in the leadership. Let's not even say Putin, in the Russian leadership mind, yes.
And they are aware, at least they would have been aware, I would assume you would say, when they attacked Ukraine, that this would draw the ire of NATO countries and would lead to a proxy war where NATO would be funding the countries that you would assume that didn't come as a shock to Putin, correct?
Correct. But again, Putin and the Russian leadership had a inflated image of their military capability before this kicked off, right? They thought that they could stand up to Western weaponry and tactics. Don't forget, not only are we giving Ukrainians weapons, we've been training them in Western style tactics of fire and maneuver for quite a while. Maneuver warfare is that's an American thing, right?
Well, remember that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah.
Okay.
Because when it comes to, because we're just existing in your hypothetical of your reason why Russia invaded, right? And
right.
Yeah. So I might disagree with some, which we can talk about later. But just if it's true that they invaded for these jokes, what I would say to that is Russia understood that they were basically engaging in acts that would lead to World War III. Because they know if they would have swept through Ukraine, even if they would have went swimmingly as they hoped, and then started to launch attacks in NATO countries, that would have triggered, what is it, I forget what the article is.
Article 5.
Article 5, which would have triggered basically the entire NATO alliance into going to war with Russia, and Russia knew that. So if this is such... Go ahead.
I think there's another piece that I haven't brought up that maybe we're missing here. Mm-hmm. I think that Russia thought, as much as I despise Uncle Joe Biden, I think that Russia thought that the West was going to be completely weak on this, that NATO was fractured, which it was. There was a lot of in the lead up to this. France was trying to appease and do the French thing with the white flag. Joke, a meme, but
right.
Germany not wanting to have anything to do with it. Blah blah blah. Well, he sorely miscalculated. Biden is a weak leader. However, in this, he's done pretty well. That we brought back together and brought the NATO alliance stronger. Finland has joined NATO. Sweden is in the process of joining NATO.
France is joining China.
All of the NATO countries are increasing their spending towards NATO, which means we'll be able to back off a little on that. That's right.
If we just spend hundreds of billions and now we'll save money in the future. No, I'm not buying it. That's not the way our government works. They're not going to all of a sudden.
You're right. You're right. Probably not. But in theory, it's it'd be good.
So if you give me a second, like the reason I brought this up,
the opposite effect of what he thought. He thought they were going to be weak and fractured. When in reality, it strengthened NATO and strengthened NATO's ties and binds back to the Cold War era, right?
Okay.
Where everybody was.
So what I would say is this, right? This is what I don't understand about this line of thinking. There's this sort of bipolar messaging that comes from everyone surrounding this conflict. On one hand, we're told, oh, Russia's getting their ass. I talk to lefties all the time that say this. Russia's already lost. They have no chance of winning at this point. And then on the other hand, they're like, please keep sending billions or they'll invade Poland tomorrow, right? We hear, oh, Putin's not a madman. He's not a madman. He's not going to go the way of using nuclear weapons or, in ushering in World War III. He's, he might be a bad dude, but he's not a madman. And then we're told, but he's so insane that he was willing to go to World War III and fight all the NATO countries for these choke points. Like, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense, because if it's true, right? Like, or if we stop funding Ukraine, then he'll lick his wounds and attack again. But if we continue to fund Ukraine, he won't lick his wounds and attack again. Like, none of this makes sense.
In the Russian leadership's mind, these choke points are an existential need for Russia. To them, you have to remember, Russia has a long history of being invaded. And these choke points are where every invasion in history of Russia have come from. So in their mind, they have to control that. Just like America knows we need to control ourselves, even though we're doing a terrible job of it. We need to control our southern border, right? Russia needs to control these choke points in their mind. Because in their thought process, NATO is a threat to Russia.
Well, it is. We'll get to that, right? NATO is a threat to Russia.
NATO's not going to invade Russia.
We're literally... listen.
Hang on. I want to jump in here and ask for a point of... ask something of both of you. It's obviously true that the propaganda in this entire affair has been extreme on both sides. So what I want to ask both of you quickly is, what do you guys think the solution to cutting through that propaganda is, and how do we know what the actual scenario on the ground is? Rob, go ahead and give me your answer first.
Well, we don't know. Who are you going to trust, right? Like, obviously, we're victims in this country of propaganda from our institutions. I think it's funny when I see right-wingers, particularly white-wingers that make... white-wingers, what the hell is that? Right-wingers. Now, holy shit, here we go with the white nationalism. No, like... people that are like Trump supporters, or people that were Ron Paul supporters, or Rand Paul supporters, or DeSantis supporters, who by default, to their credit, are distrusting of these institutions. They say, we don't trust the media. The media is the enemy of the people. The media is lying about these scandals with Trump. The media is lying about the Hunter Biden laptop. The media is lying about a litany of things. But we trust them on Ukraine. That's the one issue we trust, that they're telling the truth. Well, now, similarly, just because, and by the way, just to, not bury the lead, I have no love for Russia or Vladimir Putin either. If it was up to me, the war would end tomorrow and Putin would go home. Like that's how it would end. That would be preferable in my mind to how it should go. I don't like it when the United States invades countries in ways that I feel illegitimate. And even though I think Russia has some beef with NATO and the United States, I don't like this invasion either. However, just because I'm correctly calling out propaganda from the United States and NATO allies doesn't mean that there's not also propaganda when it comes to Russia. So you see a video. We've all seen them. You're on Twitter and you see a video and it says, here are Russian soldiers torturing Ukrainian citizens. And then you scroll down 3 tweets later and it says, here's how the Azov battalion under Zelensky's tying up Russian-speaking Ukrainians and forcibly abusing them and all this stuff. Who knows what's true? Half the time you look into it and you're like, well, that's footage from 2013. That's not even this conflict. So it's difficult to know what's going on. How do we cut through it? Well, the best way we cut through it is,
Got
real
about
people.
20 seconds, Rob.
Yeah, like citizen journalism, places like social media. That's why they want to censor social media so bad, because they need to be able to control the narrative through propaganda.
Okay, thank you for...
I tend to agree with
3 minutes, Twisted.
The mainstream media is absolutely horrible for propaganda. We all know that. My personal thing that I rely on is OSINT, which is open source intelligence, social media, and I still have some old contacts that I can't really, that
don't get locked up like the leaker. He just got leaked up a couple of hours ago. Don't go that way.
Right. The situation is, you look at Russian media, look at U.S. media. They're diametrically opposed propaganda. The truth is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? The Russians are losing a terrible amount of people. The Ukrainians are losing a terrible amount of people. The fact of the matter is, I have no love for the Ukrainian government. People think that I'm defending Ukraine here. I'm not. I don't want to see Russia hitting on NATO, right? I honestly, Ukraine is corrupt. Ukraine... I'm not defending the Ukrainian government whatsoever. Are they better than Russia? Yeah. But, one step ahead in terribleness, So it's more about the fact of I want to see Russia's capability to conduct expeditionary warfare eliminated.
Okay. If I could just real quick, just to finish your scenario of why you say Russia's invading, again, I don't think that if you're saying they view it as an existential threat, that they don't get these choke points. And so they're willing to go to war basically with the world if necessary to get these choke points. I don't understand then why they wouldn't also view it as an existential threat to say, well, we're going to leave with our tail between our legs. I think that if it is as existential as people like you and Peter Zayan are saying, that they're going to go all in. If it's true, and Zayan goes further than you are. Zayan's saying, they're done by 250. They're done by 2050. Their country will cease to exist as we know it by 2050. And so they realize at this point, and he's like, and so the United States then, it realizes it has to win this battle without putting boots on the ground. I don't think Putin will draw that distinction. I don't think Putin's willing to say, my legacy will be shattered, I will be ousted, I'll be assassinated, I'll be shamed by my own people, but I'll still have some reservations about using our most sophisticated weaponry. I don't think that's the case. And so even under your scenario, I think the best case scenario is to try to do our best as NATO and as the United States to have a peaceful resolution instead of doing what we're doing, which is lying, having boots on the ground, encouraging the Ukraine to attack targets inside of Russia, and basically saying that even when Ukraine wants to go to the peace table, that the United States is like, no, we don't think it's worth it. I think that this ends in a very, very dark place. Best case scenario, how it ends is hundreds of thousands of more Russians and Ukrainians die, and there's still no resolution in sight. Worst case, it becomes World War III, and I'm not willing to play either of those games.
Do you have an immediate response to that, Twisted?
I'm working there.
Okay. Well, go ahead and get your thoughts together. I want to pose another question. Seems how you are taking a moment. Another question I want to ask is, so another thing that's very contentious about this war is the true motivations and the true reasons behind it for the West and for Ukraine and NATO. Now, one of the reasons that I've been more on the it's a money laundering scheme, it's a political favor scheme side of that debate from the beginning is because during the early course of the war, we had NATO and American political leaders telling Ukraine not to go to the negotiation table. The most notable one was when Ukraine was talking about going to negotiations with Russia, and the very next day, Boris Johnson has the Ukrainian president fly out to him and say, do not negotiate with Russia. I would like to hear both of you comment on that.
Well, I'm going to go back to some things that Rob said previously.
Okay. And then you can get back to what I said.
Russia would not respond as if it's an existential threat. Honestly, we don't really know. I mean, I'm not Putin. I'm not in his mind. I would be really, really interested to see some of the intelligence on his personality that, you and I are not and will never have access to. I almost have to believe there is a reason they think that he would not respond in that way. Unless people, an invasion of Russia occurred. I don't trust, or I can't say that I thoroughly trust our government. However, I don't trust intelligence agencies at the administrative level, but I trust the intelligence gatherers, right? So that's the data that I would really like to see. I really don't know. There's also a conversation to be had of Russia can't even keep tank treads on their tanks. They can't keep tires from being dry rotted on their trucks. Why do we think most of their nukes are even going to work?
Well, I don't think that's a gamble that I'm willing to take. The material is there. So maybe the ICBM isn't working so hot anymore. Doesn't matter. As you know, once you have these sort of materials, there are ways to detonate them that are far more low tech.
That is actually not true.
You don't think so?
The materials do degrade over time.
Of course, that's true. But
specifically the tritium, which is used to boost the yield as in the core with a boosted device, which all current devices are boosted devices, that is a very short half-life.
Let me put it this way then, right? I think that if your side is gambling on the fact of, well, we'll provoke a nuclear war, but when Russia hits the button, they won't work, that's a very poor strategy. I'll also say this, that having, right, and I know you've been listening to Peter Zayan, I could hear it in the things you're saying, right? Zayan talks about Russia's always had a problem in all of these wars, that it always starts out like this. They're not good militaristically at planning like the day-to-day things, like how to get trucks to ship things to this point. That is a different level of intelligence and a different skill set than upkeeping a nuclear arsenal. I have not heard Zayan, or as far as I know, any other person that has made the argument that we fundamentally believe that Russia is no longer nuclear capable. I think that is completely erroneous.
I wasn't saying that we should gamble on that. It's more of just a thought,
I understand, but I'm just saying my pushback on that would be, why wouldn't take it? That'd be like if my neighbor has a gun, right? And I'm like, I'm going to go piss with him. I'm going to keep slapping his kid in the face because I think he doesn't clean his gun well and it won't go off. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take that chance. That's not going to factor into my calculus.
Yes, there is a risk of nuclear war, right? However, if we allow Russia to basically bully their way into these things because they have nuclear weapons, what message does that send to the next guy that gets nukes? India, Pakistan, North Korea. It sends a message that, oh, well, if you've got nukes, we'll let you get away with whatever the hell you want.
But isn't that the status quo anyway?
Point, we have to do a little bit of a dice roll to stop this shit from happening in the future.
I disagree. I think that the actual opposite is true. I think that if that was the case, that we were like, well, now we got to draw a line in the sand because we need the rest of the world to know just because you have nuclear weapons, you can't bully. And yet it seems to be the opposite when it's people that consider themselves our allies that are invading countries or bombing countries, or when NATO themselves decides they want to do it, like in Libya. So the moral high ground does not exist for the NATO countries after what they did to Libya, after what they continue to do in Syria. Like they went to Libya, were upset because Gaddafi sought to sort of get away from a US dollar standard, wanted to create an African dinar. They were saying in the UN about how human rights were getting better in Libya. And then all of a sudden they said, well, we're going to finance a bunch of Islamic terrorists to overthrow Gaddafi. They sodomized him with a bayonet. When Hillary Clinton heard about it, she said, we came, we saw, he died. And now there's open slave markets in Libya. And by the way, this will be the fate of Ukraine as well.
You know that the Libya thing was a UN sanctioned operation, right?
Sure, NATO, UN, correct.
NATO's not UN. UN is wholly
NATO,
independent from NATO.
NATO, of course, but NATO was on the ground. NATO was the organization providing militaristic assistance along with the United States government. Saying that the UN was involved doesn't give it any more legitimacy.
I'm asking this question. I honestly do not know. Was it under a NATO flag or was it just a group of NATO countries? Because, for instance, the Gulf War, Persian Gulf War I, right? Iraq invaded Kuwait. That was a coalition of NATO countries, but it did not happen under the NATO flag. It was just happened to be NATO countries that allied together to do this, right? I am pretty sure, not positive, that's why I asked, pretty sure that the same is true in Libya.
Let's see. Just the first thing I bring up says the decision to intervene in Libya in 2011 was made after NATO members had meetings and resolved over disagreements whether military operations in Libya should include attacks on ground forces. Multi-state NATO-led coalition began military intervention in Libya to implement United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973. So it was a NATO-led, according to the sources. Okay. I always thought that it's irrelevant anyway, right? Whether it was officially NATO or just almost all the NATO countries came together to do this, right? It's sort of irrelevant. The point I'm trying to make is
it's not irrelevant. There's a big difference geopolitically speaking between NATO countries and NATO.
Let's talk about that for a second, right? Because let's get to why I think Russia invaded. I don't think it's this, they were always going to do it no matter what. Even under what you and Peter Zan are saying, the idea is that the reason these choke points need controlled by Russia isn't necessarily that they're a bunch of greedy people like, yes, we need this land to enrich ourselves. It is that they are fearful because they've been invaded so many times that in order to properly defend their country, they would need to control these access points. Therefore, any actions that were considered to be militaristic aggressions towards Russia, if you're right that they were fearful for these choke points, would increase their fear and their desire to control these choke points. In other words, if a militaristic alliance that's sole reason for creation was to take down the Soviet Union and vis-a-vis Russia, then basically, it's continuing to span westward to your borders. Like, wouldn't you think they would say, oh shit, now we got to make sure we defend ourselves even more? And in addition,
NATO doesn't expand. They don't recruit people. They don't recruit members. The members ask to join, right? Finland asks to join. Sweden asks to join. Well, Ukraine has asked to join, and we denied them because you can't join if you have a territorial dispute.
But just because a nation asked to join doesn't mean it's not expansion if NATO accepts. And NATO's been pushing, like, I'm not going to get into it. I can't claim to be an expert. When we see things like the Minsk Accord and other things like that, constantly Russia's been like, listen, we want assurances.
If you want to get into the Minsk Accord, do you want to get into the Budapest Memorandum?
We can get into that. I'm admitting to not knowing as much about it as probably the average person talking about these things.
The Budapest Memorandum happened when, after the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine had possession of many, I don't remember the exact figure, but thousands of nuclear warheads that were former Soviet. Under the Budapest Memorandum, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States said, we will guarantee Ukrainian territorial integrity and Ukrainian sovereignty if you give up your nukes. They agreed. So at this point, Russia has violated that, and in reality, we have violated our end of the agreement too, because if we upheld our end of the agreement to the letter of that memorandum, we would be boots on the ground in Ukraine right now against Russians.
I don't really care about that. We're looking at it from the reasoning of why Russia would have
care about Minsk then.
If you'll let me finish, I'll explain why.
Okay.
We're looking at it from the perspective of why Russia would have decided to invade. Your argument is, well, they're so scared shitless that eventually a country will attack them that they have to control these 6 choke points, so much so that they're willing right now, because they view this as the last generation they have a chance, they're willing to go to the war and create World War III, basically with almost no allies, save maybe China, maybe North Korea, because they know that all the NATO countries and countries that are sort of on good terms with NATO will end up siding with NATO. So Russia's like, this is a last-ditch effort. My point is, if we know that about Russia, why would we constantly be expanding NATO? I'm not interested in the semantic jargon that like, oh, technically it's not advancing if other countries say, can we join NATO? And NATO says, sure, that's not NATO expanding. I disagree. From the eyes of Russians, they would view that as NATO expanding. Let's talk about some of the things they did. We've increasingly put nuclear weapons and other arms closer and closer to the integral border of Russia. We interfered in the 2014 elections in taking out a Russian allied president in Yanukovych and installed Poroshenko, who was basically a puppet of the Barack Obama administration. The biggest ally of Russia at this point, geographically near them, would be Syria and Assad, which we've had boots on the ground, violating their sovereignty and actually bombing the government of Assad, never being able to prove that the reason we bombed them was legitimate, particularly the Donetsk chemical attack that whistleblowers from the IPCW said that they didn't feel occurred in the first place. We've also bombed Syria, both Trump, who I decried for doing this, and Biden, because allegedly Iranians, who Biden told us we need to be involved in a nuclear deal with, went into Syria, then bombed U.S. interest in Iraq, and so we bombed the sovereign nation of Syria in an effort to kill Iranians. In addition to that, we also have biological weapons, I won't say weapons, we have biological facilities stationed in Ukraine that hold dangerous materials, and that's by the admission of the United States. Now, the reason that we have these biolabs is because in 2005, I believe, we signed an accord with Ukraine once they were leaving the Soviet Union that said we would help them dispose of these materials. Now we're near 20 years on, and yet still we're there. Why has it taken 20 years to dispose of this material? All of these things, if they were happening around the United States borders from a hostile country, say China, if China had biolabs stationed right outside the border of Mexico with dangerous chemical and biological materials in them, if they were stationing weapons like the Cuban Missile Crisis closer and closer to the United States would rightfully be angry. If they were attacking our closest geographical allies like Canada, and China had boots on the grounds in Canada, we would be furious of that. And so even if I don't think that Russia was necessarily legitimate to invade, certainly the actions of the United States and NATO were an intentional provocation. And so I don't believe then that the United States is the best actor or NATO is the best actor to say, well, now we have to intervene. Now we have to be there.
Well, don't get me wrong. I in no way believe that, the United States is an innocent actor. I in no way believe that NATO is an innocent actor. We all have our all those countries have their guilt that they've done in their own interest, right? As far as the biolabs, I'm glad you change that from bioweapons, because there's a huge difference between a bioweapons lab and a biolab.
Can you explain that difference?
A biolab typically is involved in research for curing disease or defending against bioweapons attacks. For instance, the U.S.A. or CDC. Right.
But you acknowledge that the stated purpose for getting involved in these labs from the United States perspective was to dismantle biological weapons and chemical weapons. Okay, well, so then if you're Russia, right, and you're like, okay, our greatest enemies 100 miles out of our border operating labs that they're admitting have biological weapons in them. They're just saying, but we're only dismantling them. How would the United States feel if China said, oh, we know you're concerned that we have deadly biological agents that could kill millions of your people 100 miles outside your border, but trust us, they're not weapons. We're just doing research. One, we wouldn't believe them. And second, even if that's true, even if we did believe them, that doesn't mean that an accident can't happen. In fact, we're probably looking at COVID coming from a lab leak in China. So if you're Russia,
agree with that.
Right. So if you're Russia and you're like, okay, so the whole world had to stop because the United States was funding this fucking lab in China and it released this deadly virus. Who's to say that the United States doing these labs in Ukraine that they're admitting have even more insane biological components, that there won't be some sort of accident or intentional behavior from that? Now, I'm not saying that this is justification. Well, right. But wouldn't you be pissed? Wouldn't you be pissed if you were Russia?
Not
I would.
The point of trying to take.
I don't like Putin. I will guarantee you. I will guarantee that we don't even have to think about it. We can see a history. Why? You're aware of like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. The United States didn't really like it when our biggest enemy had dangerous materials right off the coast of our country. Didn't care for that, right?
There's a difference there, right? The difference is back in that era, deliverable nuclear weapons were primarily done by bomber, right? Which means it was slow, could be shot down, air defenses, whether it be surface air or fighter defenses. The difference was that Russia put not just nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons on ballistic missiles. They didn't have the capability to get nuclear weapons to the United States on ballistic missiles in any significant amount. The whole idea of the missile gap back then didn't exist. That was false intelligence that was passed on to Kennedy, right?
That may be true, but there are differences in any two situations.
Well, here's the difference, okay? Now we have this capability to deliver these weapons instantly, within 30 minutes to 45 minutes from submarines, from ICBMs. The putting weapons close to the border really is kind of irrelevant at this point.
It's not.
Russia could have nuclear weapons in South America, and we would be at no more risk from those weapons than we are from their ICBM fields in Russia.
I'm not an expert on nuclear defense and nuclear weapons, so I'm not going to claim to, but I tend to think that you're wrong because of things that I do know. For example, I know that we station nuclear weapons in Turkey, correct?
Tactical nuclear weapons.
Okay, why? If we could deliver them just as easily from submarines or from the United States.
For the tactical nuclear weapons are used on the battlefield. They're not used for striking strategic targets. They're used, for instance, if Russia, Soviet Union back in the day, right? They roll their hordes of tanks across the border. We use tactical nuclear weapons to take out those tanks. Okay? They're small, low yield, flexible response, meaning that if you need to hit here, you hit here. If you need to hit here, you hit here. Think of them like you know what the Moab is, right?
Sure, I know what
nuclear Moab. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a huge difference between strategic and tactical weapons.
Right? But that difference shows why the difference you talked about is irrelevant, right? Because you're like, well, the difference between having dangerous biological potential weapons right outside the border of Ukraine and the fact that there were weapons right outside the United States is the weapons outside the United States were ballistic missiles, and now we have capabilities to launch ballistic missiles.
They were strategic grade.
Okay, but the reason that difference isn't really going to be substantial in why it applies to this situation is because we're not going to just nuke Russia. We're not going to do that, right? It's the same reason that we have tactical nuclear. Why they would be upset that there were tactical nukes in Turkey or closer to the border of Russia. It's not like they're going to say, well, why do we care if the United States and NATO has tactical nuclear weapons 10 miles outside our border? Because they could just hit us with an ICBM at any time. Because that won't happen. So think about it real quick. Let me finish. Let me finish.
Tactical weapons into Eastern Europe, into the Baltic states. That has not happened.
Right, so let me finish. So when we're talking...
There are not warheads in Poland, for instance.
Okay, but we're talking hypothetically, if those weapons were 100 miles outside of Russia, why they would be upset. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, if they were there, but they're not.
Okay, so they're not there. Instead, it's biological weapons.
They're not biological weapons, though.
To Russia, they are. They are by one. It's admitted by the United States that these facilities, at least at one point, contained biological weapons. And if the United States is your greatest enemy, who you feel lies about you all the time and is engaged in color revolutions in Ukraine and is bombing your ally, you're not going to take them at their word like, okay, they say that it's not weapons. And secondly, even if it's true, as I already said, that it's not weapons, we've already seen what's claimed to be an accidental leak that led to devastation all across the world. So under both scenarios, it's similar to the fact that when we thought that there was a threat to the United States in Cuba, it pissed off the leadership of the United States, rightfully so. That would also apply to Russia. When they see this existential threat, that's 100.
And they can get pissed off. I mean,
right. That's the point. So the point I'm trying to make is, the point I'm making is this. I don't agree with you that it was inevitable that they would attack these choke points. I don't agree with that. But I think the spirit of what you're saying speaks to the fact that Russia, whether it be rightfully or wrongfully, fears that they're being encircled and they will not be able to protect themselves. And so what has the United States and NATO done as a result? Engaged in color revolutions in Ukraine to take away their ally, bombed their ally Assad, stationed bio labs right outside the border, right? Offered to send Ukraine weapons.
I mean, I'm not going to play the debate, bro. Give me your sources, but I want you to think about it, right?
Okay.
Where is the hard evidence that we instituted that revolution in Ukraine that ousted that president?
Two things. One, it fits the power of color revolutions that we've seen previously. Second, we have seen people like Victoria Nuland on phone calls that talked about how, okay, we need to get in the phone with this guy. This is the person we want to win. Now, I will agree that that phone call by itself does not show that the United States engaged in a color revolution. For example, you could say that that was just the United States reacting to a natural revolution that was occurring, and that might be true. Regardless of the United States, we do know that NGOs that the United States funded heavily and other organizations like George Soros Open Society Foundation funded, we know that they were instrumental in achieving success. I've no doubt that there were people in Ukraine pissed off and would be incepted easily to a revolution. The question is, did they do it organically on their own to start, or was it started through outside influences? Either way, a lot of the success, let me finish this. A lot of the success was because of this funding from places like NGOs that were funded by the United States.
And I will agree with that. I believe that it began organically, but then it became funded through the NGOs. Sure.
So look at it through Russia. So look at it through Russia's perspective, right? Let's look at it through the Schrodinger's revolution here. On one side, let's say that it was funded by the George Soros, and the United States funded started this color revolution, right? That scenario. Clearly, Russia would be pissed. Let's say it was not that. Let's say it was the other way, that it was started organically, but Open Society and the Obama administration and others funded this revolution, which led to their success. It's a horse apiece for Russia. They still look at it like, okay, we had this ally in the president of, and you might hate that. You might have hated Yanukovych. That's fine. I'm not saying whether or not he was a good guy or a bad guy. I'm saying, looking at it from Russia's perspective, they're like, okay, this dude was our ally, right? And then people got pissed, whether it be organically or not. Then the United States and other countries started meddling, and they got a guy put in that was basically their closest ally. So much so that the United States funded the creation of what was called the NABU, which was the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. This organization literally took orders from the Obama State Department on who to prosecute. And this was when you heard Joe Biden's quid pro quo, for example, when he was saying, like, we're not going to give you this $1 billion unless you fire this prosecutor that we're looking at, or that was looking into his son's company. And then it goes to the NABU. The reason I bring all this up is, imagine if our FBI was created and funded by, say, Spain, right? Wouldn't that be unusual? One might think, well, geez, if the most powerful investigative and police force in the country is funded almost solely by an outside country, we think that that country has too much influence in that country. That's how Russia would be looking at this. They'd be like, holy cow, we just lost one of our greatest allies, and they've gone to now our greatest enemy, so much so that their primary police and investigative unit is completely controlled and funded by the United States. So the idea of, was it technically a color revolution? It's irrelevant to the way Russia would look at it. Russia lost one of their greatest allies, and instead it was instituted a puppet of their greatest enemy. You know, why would you poke a bear that you think is unhinged so much so that eventually they're going to come for these choke points? Wouldn't the correct course of action to be not bomb Syria, not put boots on the ground in Syria, not push for this revolution in Ukraine, not station these biolabs? That would have been a better solution. And that gets me, I'll say this real quick, that gets me to this point. Let's say that it's true that Russia's horrible and someone needs to step up to them. I don't think the United States is the correct actor, because our intelligence agencies and our military leadership have shown themselves to be so corrupt for so many years. I'm sorry, they've cried wolf too many times. I don't trust them. So if someone needs to act, it should not be NATO and should not be the United States. They have lost all credibility.
I do not believe that our intelligence agencies, nor our current military leadership aside, our military leadership is corrupt and twisted. So I don't believe that.
They told us we had 17 generals in Afghanistan, correct, that were in charge of the Afghanistan conflict. 17.
Mm-hmm.
20 years plus we were there, correct?
Yes.
Approaching, depending on how you look at it, over $1 trillion spent. You would agree with that?
Yeah, I don't know what the figure was.
But we'll just, I'm with you. I'm not a source, please.
$1 trillion.
Yeah, it was a ton of money. Can we just say that? It was a shitload of money for 20 years. Okay, so we were told, was there any one of those 17 generals that said, this is a fucking disaster, when we leave, this place is going to fall to shit? Did any of those generals say that?
I don't know.
They didn't. In fact, up until
Probably
the
not.
day we left, they were saying, oh, don't worry, the Afghan security forces, they're going to be able to hold. They failed in 3 days. 3 days.
Well, I thoroughly believe that Afghanistan is, was, and always will be a losing proposition of somewhere to have a war. It's way too tribalized.
Agreed.
You cannot win in Afghanistan, right?
And yet that's not what our military leadership told us for 20
for
years.
For a good reason, originally, right?
What was that reason?
Going after bin Laden. Once we nailed bin Laden and killed his ass, that's when we should have pulled out and say, hey, you Afghanis, do what you do, right?
We didn't even have
100%.
evidence. We didn't even have evidence that he was in Afghanistan, and it turns out he wasn't. That would have been something for more of a special ops type thing.
We had evidence he was in Tora Bora.
Right.
And then apparently he moved because I don't remember which general it was, but one of the generals that we had there was so brilliant that, hey, let's go and try and hit enemy number one of the United States in Tora Bora with just a few American personnel. Let's use these Afghanis as our main force. Fucking brilliant.
It wasn't. It may have been brilliant in paper, but the way the Afghan war played out wasn't
sarcastic.
Yeah, I was about to tell you, Rob. Yeah,
I was going to say the way it played out. I mean, I don't know. I never served. My friends that served in Afghanistan. To me, the horror of it is the very people you're training in the day are killing you at night, and that's different.
Very, very, very Vietnamish.
Right. Right, that's
way.
Different than like when we would think of like World War II, which on a scale was much bigger, don't get me wrong. But the idea that you can't even, you may be training and arming the very guy that will kill you. Like there's a level of, you could understand the high PTSD levels that come from a situation like that. And I've seen friends of mine that dealt with that. The point is, like the idea, whether it be corruption or incompetence, our leadership of our military, 17 different generals, as far as I'm concerned, failed dramatically. Afghanistan is just as bad, in some ways perhaps worse today than it was before we went in. The original mission wasn't just about getting bin Laden. It was also about wresting control from the Taliban and things like that. That was a complete failure. That was a failure so bad that when Biden pulled out, he had to beg the Taliban to protect the own Air Force, which then led to ISIS-K, which I think they just made up, bombing and killing U.S. servicemen. Oh, by the way, the Taliban, we're told, is the very group that freed ISIS-K. Imagine that. They free these prisoners, and the United States knows it and says, hey, can you protect us from the prisoners you just freed? And they're like, sure. And then those prisoners kill U.S. soldiers, and everyone's like, "Ah, shucks."
Oh yeah.
And I don't believe
the way that pullout was done was a travesty. That was the worst. Terrible.
Yeah. So, but you look at that, right? You look at Afghanistan, the 20-year history of it. Look at Syria, right? Syria, our leadership was so corrupt under Syria that the executive who is in charge of the military, Donald Trump, made an order to pull all troops out of Syria, and his generals lied to him about how many troops were there so that they could continue to keep troops there. You don't think that's corrupt?
I don't know if that happened, but if that did happen, I will agree it is.
Libya, the situation in Libya, not just Benghazi, but we already talked about that. The Iraq War.
So, allow me to jump in really quick. Twisted, hang on. I can vouch for Rob here that did indeed happen. I don't know how you missed it. That went around the conservative news sphere for quite a while. That multiple generals lied to Trump and said that there was a complete pullout when there was not. Continue.
The Iraq War is kind of we did it for a good reason, but we had bad information on that reason, right? Call it a preemptive war. We saw and you have to give me the a little bit of leeway that our intelligence thought there were WMDs in Iraq, okay? Whether that was bad reporting by the people on the ground reporting it or what, I don't know. But our National Command Authority thought that there were WMDs on the ground in Iraq. Mm-hmm. We executed that war brilliantly. Absolutely brilliantly.
Right. Well, and even more brilliant was probably
execute well was after the war with, what was his name, Brenner, who came in and said, "Oh, we're just going to disband the whole Iraqi army." Well, all of a sudden you have hundreds of thousands of unemployed Iraqi military personnel that are pissed off that they're unemployed. What are they going to do? They're going to become insurgents. That was absolutely the most asinine decision I've ever seen made.
So I'm not trying to get into a history of all of these wars. I'm just making the point that there's been incompetence or corruption at the top levels of our military and intelligence for a long time. We now see, as far as I'm concerned, maybe you're different. I believe that our intelligence agencies engaged in a coup against Donald Trump when they accused him of collaborating with Russians, attempting to get dirt about his opponent Hillary Clinton from Russians, and to prove that, they allowed Hillary Clinton to get dirt on Donald Trump from Russians, then paid that Russian who they suspected of being a spy in the late 2000 aughts, I guess you call it, Igor Dushenko, right? The point is, I think that they have always been incompetent or corrupt, at least in my lifetime, and it's getting worse. The corruption's getting more blatant. So now, all of a sudden, I'm supposed to believe...
it's certainly not getting better.
Right. So now I'm supposed to believe, but we have to trust them when they say, well, it's all about choke points and, we basically have to stop Russia here. And don't look at the man behind the curtain that maybe we provoked them. I'm sorry, I'm not buying it. They have not, I'm not a conspiracy theorist because I don't trust them. It's not my fault. It's their fault that they have lied and been incompetent and corrupt for my entire life that I don't trust them.
Here's the thing. I'm not sure. I have not seen any reports in most media sources that our generals are saying they're going after these choke points, right? That's more of a looking at the big picture geopolitical thing, which I hope to God that our senior military staff sees that. Is, if me, a fucking knuckle-dragging Marine, can see that, I hope that our senior leadership can see that.
I just don't believe it. I think it's a compelling story that Zahan's telling.
I think that there are multiple moving pieces here. I feel like the choke point is a main piece. I think that the fear that Russia has of NATO, that NATO is an aggressive alliance, plays into it. I don't believe that NATO is an aggressive alliance, but I can see it from the Russian standpoint of believing it's an aggressive alliance, right? Combined with Putin wanting a legacy, combined with the fact that the Ukraine has a lot of rich natural resources. It's a primary source of potash in the world. gas and oil under
You
happens to
should
be
have
under
just
the Donbass region.
You should have had Zahan come debate me. I know. I've watched. He's an interesting guy. He is. I've watched all of this. I've probably watched about 12 hours of his material. Right? Like, yeah, Zahan. Like, I would love to ask him some questions of the nature that I was asking you. That, like, I don't understand why Russia would be like, oh, if there are boots on the ground, we'll use nukes. But if there's not boots on the ground, even if we get our ass kicked, we won't. That makes no sense to me. I don't get it. And I think that he's telling a story. He's telling a narrative that makes sense. When you listen to it, you're like, wow. And he's telling it in such an articulate and confident way that it makes sense. I just don't believe it. I don't believe that no matter what the United States or NATO would have ever done, inevitably, no matter what, Russia was coming for these choke points. I don't believe that. And even if that is the case, I think that the actions of the United States exacerbated that, and the reasons I've said. But before we move on to, like, where do we go from here? Like,
I think that one of the, I just want to bring something like really, where we really screwed up was back when the Soviet Union fell. You know that Russia wanted to join NATO, and we said no, basically because they're Russia. That was.
So do you blame them for not? Do you blame them for not trusting NATO?
The dumbest move we have ever made. Could you imagine if Russia was actually allied with NATO? China wouldn't stand a damn chance in this geopolitical world.
But I don't know, like, because alliances can fall apart, but
sure,
so
can,
before we move on to where do we go from here, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the news that we just had a National Guardsman, I think, that leaked this stuff, which I find it very interesting. The media now all of a sudden they're concerned about leaks again. Not a whistleblower when it's making the Biden administration look bad, but it turns out that, as I predicted, and I said this from the get-go, we were lied to. The Biden administration lied. They lied to us about how many casualties there were of Ukraine. They lied to us about whether or not U.S. boots were on the ground. They are. And this was a trigger that Peter Zan said would cause Russia to respond with nuclear weapons. Now, Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist that reported on the Nord Stream bombing, has wrote a story yesterday or today that says that U.S. intelligence believes Zelensky has stolen $400 million for him and his cronies.
No surprise.
And so
there.
So with all of this coming, that these were things that people like me, and I'm sure a lot of other people were talking about. You know, Zach asked the question of motivation. Well, there's potential motivation of energy sources that we see there. There's a motivation of sort of consolidating a globalist agenda to go after people that are seen as outside of that, like China or Russia. But I think one of them is personal benefit. We know that there is forgive me bringing up Biden's name with the word incestuous, sharing with his daughter, but there's this sort of incestuous relationship between Ukraine. People forget. The entire Trump-Russia collusion thing was about Trump's team trying to get dirt from a hostile foreign power, a foreign country, against his opponent. It was the Financial Times wrote a piece in late August, right before the 2016 election, saying that a parliamentarian in Ukraine named Lutsenko admitted that the Ukraine was interfering in the United States election because they felt that Trump would try to pursue a peaceful resolution with Russia, which would leave Ukraine high and dry. So these parliamentarians that were pro-Poroshenko and pro-Obama State Department admitted that they were releasing dirt in the form of this black ledger that Paul Manafort supposedly's name was all through, which, by the way, has never been proven, any of the allegations in, but they released it in order to interfere in the election. And our State Department and our FBI, they were all cool with it. They didn't freak out and say, oh, we need a special counsel, oh, we need an FBI investigation. That was cool. That Ukrainian, we know the incestuous relationship between Biden, his family, John Kerry's son, and a litany of other prominent politicians in NATO and UN and United States countries that are making money hand over fist. The game is quite simple. We send billions of dollars of Ukraine to help build their country. Then agencies in the Ukraine hire the family and friends of politicians in this country, pay them exorbitant amounts of money for skills that they don't have. And so all of that had a chance to come crashing down with Donald Trump when he asked Zelensky, will you cooperate with an investigation to show this sort of corruption? They used a quid pro quo to fire a prosecutor looking into this. So there's absolutely, from the standpoint of Ukraine, you're going to use whatever leverage you can to get the United States involved. And maybe some of that leverage is Well, the carrot is we're getting rich. We're making money hand over fist. Raytheon's making money. Northrop Grumman's making money, right? And the stick is, by the way, if you don't cooperate, maybe we'll start releasing some of those files on what was going on here in 2014, 2015.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to discount any of that it doesn't exist, but I don't study that side of all this stuff. I stick kind of more to the military side of things, right? That's not my strong point. All the behind the scenes politicking. I don't really follow a whole lot of that beyond the fact that I know that Biden's a shitbag.
Let me ask you this then. That's fine, right? That's perfectly fine. Much in the same way that I can't fucking tell you about the Belarus whatever agreement I can't. I'm not going to pretend, right? So that's perfectly reasonable. But let me ask you this: even if you're right and Zahen's right, can I at least get you to agree that there is no evidence that that's why the United States is acting? That it is entirely possible, even if you think the United States actions are necessary, that the people in charge of our government at this time aren't doing it for altruistic reasons. They might be accidentally doing the right thing. They're doing it for shitbag reasons, but you think that it might serendipitously be a good thing.
I will concede the possibility exists that is a part of why we're responding the way we are.
Well, you admitted that you don't see any evidence that anyone said this was about choke points and things like that, right?
Not openly. I think that there would be as much as our politicians like to fearmonger us about a certain virus that spread around rapidly.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said the name of that.
I'm not sure our government wants to fearmonger us on Russia's going to attack NATO, right?
Hey, can I take a brief pause here and just ask everyone, where is this streaming? Because if it's to YouTube, I have to be careful about some of the things.
No, we're not on YouTube. We're not on YouTube.
I'm on Twitch.
I'm on YouTube, but I don't give a fuck. They can kick me off. They do anyway. So, I don't want to get. That's my primary concern. I don't want any of the nice people that help out with this to lose their channel because I'm saying the C word or anything. I can say it now. COVID.
Team Adventurous is 100% dedicated to free speech. If I would never have someone on and be like, you can't say this.
Right. Yeah.
It's sad. I have to I'm doing a panel show Saturday. I had to change the name of the title because it had the word trans in it, and it's going to be streamed to YouTube, which means that it'll immediately get blacklisted. So, yeah. But yeah, it sucks that we're in that. But so let me ask just a couple questions about how things are going then. Do you think that if the United States stopped funding Ukraine right now, that Russia would overtake them?
It depends. There's a couple variables that go into that. Can Russia generate and maintain and sustain production of primarily artillery shells with the sanctions placed upon them? Because Ukraine can't. They don't have the industrial capacity to produce artillery shells at the rate needed. Hell, we can barely support that.
So you're saying that you're not sure. There's a chance if the United States stopped funding Ukraine today, they still may, quote, win. They might still be able to ultimately expel
most likely not, because they're going to run through all of the supplies that they have of, for instance, the HIMARS, missile systems, the javelins, all those systems, weapon systems that we sent them, that would run out of the A, maintenance, and B, ordnance that goes with those weapon systems.
Okay, then my question is this.
So,
how long are you suggesting that we can keep funding Ukraine, and to the tune of how much money? Can we go another 10 years?
I don't think the thing's going to go another 10 years.
But what if it does? Where is your breaking point where you're willing to cut your losses? Because that's the rub, right? That's the rub.
Breaking point.
Because let's approach it from my point.
Russia, Ukraine is getting basically global support. Russia's getting almost no support. They're getting token support financially from China. They're not getting any weapons from China.
Not yet.
They're getting junk drones from Iran. They're asking North Korea for AK ammo.
So if I may, let's.
North Korea.
I'm talking through your perspective on this. Let's look at it through my perspective, where I think that it's all corrupt. It's a money laundering scheme, right? I would predict that our military and our intelligence would say exactly what you just said. They'll say, well, we're not sure. In fact, they're even more shameless. They say, oh, we're kicking ass. Russia's getting blown out. But you got to keep sending billions. You got to. And then reports are coming out like, oh, Zelensky and his cronies.
Russia is kind of getting its ass kicked.
Okay,
I mean,
all right, so let me finish. And then we find out that, like, Zelensky and his cronies are Seymour Hersh says, which granted, you shouldn't take any journalistic gospel, but there are reports that Zelensky and his cronies stole $400 million. We do know for a fact that most of the people in Congress that are cheering this on and sending this money, including Republicans and Democrats, have refused to audit the money. Rand Paul's repeatedly put forth amendments saying we need to audit exactly where this money. They don't want to do that. John Kirby just said the other day, we can't do that. It's an act of war.
I think we should audit. I back what we're doing.
Why do you think they're not?
We need to audit it.
Why do you think they aren't?
Like I said, I don't believe that Ukraine is innocent. Do I think that Zelensky potentially could have taken money? Yeah. Do I think that most of it is? Now, again, people have this in their mind that we're sending them $100 billion in cash. That's not what's happening. I don't know the exact percentages, but the vast majority of this, what we're sending them, is equipment. It's not money.
It's irrelevant, right? That equipment.
There is relevancy there.
It is irrelevant.
Because they're not going to steal tanks to put in their pocket, right?
Well, but okay. So I guess the argument could be that if I hand you cash, it's easier for you to do something illicit for it than if I hand you a product. But they could sell like, for example, let's go back and look at the vaunted history of the United States military helping out noble countries like this. You remember, have you ever seen the movie Rambo 3?
No, I have not.
Oh, my goodness. You haven't seen Rambo 3? What the hell?
Twisted is not very up on culture.
I don't want to watch a lot of movies.
Okay,
I mean,
so the first blood.
I mean, I grew up, focused. I always knew I wanted to be in aviation. My family's from an aviation background. My dad was a pilot in Vietnam, flew F-4s. So I grew up concentrating on studies and athletics in order to
let me explain.
As a fighter pilot, right?
Let me explain. First
so
blood.
I didn't spend a lot of time watching movies.
Hang on, Rob. Just hang on. Let him. Let's cool it down. We can keep it conversational and light.
I spent most of my time doing racial airplanes, real planes. I got my private pilot's license at 17. Started flying gliders. Got my glider rating at 14.
Twisted. We get the point.
Doing that.
We get the point.
Okay. Rambo 3, basically, the trainer of Rambo is in Afghanistan, and he's helping these noble farmers there, right? And what's happening is that Russia is attacking Afghanistan. This happened in real life, right? And they were fighting this group called the Mujahideen, was the group they were fighting in Afghanistan. And then the reason I bring up Rambo 3 is because most people have seen it, and so even if they're unaware of this conflict with the Mujahideen...
Well, I'm aware of the Soviet history and the U.S. backing the Mujahideen.
So there's a scene in that movie where you see these noble farmers, and this man stands up and he says, and in the 1,000-year history of Afghanistan, no one's ever been able to blah, blah, blah. And they're these heroes. That's basically bin Laden. That's who that is in the movie. That's what was good. Rambo's basically helping bin Laden fight the evil Russians,
the Mujahideen that we backed during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan became Al-Qaeda. Absolutely.
Right, and so we gave them money and training and weapons, and then what happened?
They kept all that and used it against us once the Soviets got defeated.
They kept it and used it against us. They sold some of it to profit. Sure. So if the argument is, well, if we send over $100 billion, it's not really just dollars. Also, it could be equipment and stuff that we're not auditing as well. So that's harder to be corrupt with.
Well, that needs to be audited too.
Let me finish. Until 10 years from now when we're told, There are terrorists now in the Ukrainian borders that somehow they got all these weapons and they're using it against U.S. allies. Now we have to go back in. Oh, and that just happens to make Raytheon more money. That just happens to benefit the military-industrial. Wow, isn't that amazing? Just like overthrowing the Shah in Iran led to us then having to back Iraq in order to fight Iran, which then led to us having to fight Iran. Just like the backing of the noble rebels that fought Gaddafi will inevitably result in us having to have a military presence in Libya. This happens over and over. And so the idea that, if it's not money, it's just equipment, it won't find itself into the wrong hands. Totally disagree. The history has proven, including with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that that's not the case. And my point that I bring this up is this. Let's say that I am right. And you're even admitting it. Ukraine's corrupt. Of course, people in the United States might be corrupt. Of course, it's strange that it's not being audited. It should be audited. What's the incentive to end this conflict then? If they're all making money hand over fist, right, and they're all corrupt about it, and you're admitting, well, of course they might be. Why would they end it? Even if they could, why would they?
Well, I mean, the end would be when Russia gets the hell out of Ukraine, right? That's when it should be ended, no matter.
How would you know if they weren't? What if they weren't?
What if they weren't?
Right. I'm sorry, that's a bad way to phrase it. What if they do leave, but they're just like, we're going to say they didn't. We're going to say they're still attacking the border. We're going to say there's still threats. There's still able. Oh, look, there was a bomb in this town.
That's unless we can completely control what these people say and do, that is while remote, a possibility. Sure.
Even more of a possibility than that could be. And what if we intentionally send material that's not enough to sway the war one way or another, to keep it going in perpetuity, because it's benefiting the leadership of the United States and NATO countries and the leadership of Ukraine.
Well,
and it might even be benefiting.
Agree with you on that. I actually somewhat agree with you on that. I do not like the fact that we are sending them this military aid piecemeal. We send them HIMARS, then we send them artillery, then we send them tanks. Just send them. Hell, we've got A10s, A10A models sitting out in the boneyard that are not being flown. They're not going to be flown. They're sitting out there wrapped in saran wrap, literally, doing nothing. Send them A10s, send them F-16s, send them F-15s, send them ATACMS, missiles, and let's get this shit done and over with. If we're not going to put boots on the ground. I honestly believe that we should go over there, enforce a no-fly zone, and possibly even put our troops on the ground to push Russia out of Ukraine. We should stop at the border. We should never cross into Russia, other than on aerial interdiction missions, right? To hit supply depots and things like that, sure.
Well, we know that
never invade
Sorry,
Russia.
Twisted, giving anybody A10s would be a mistake.
But
mute up again.
But that would end the war. That would end the war real quick.
I don't understand how you put so much faith in Peter Zan's argument about the geopolitics and choke points, but then you totally ignore the part where he says, by the way, if there's boots on the ground, Russia will use nukes. He says that, right?
That comes back to, we can't let somebody bully us just because they have nukes.
Well, it's not.
As terrible.
Well, that's a hell of a way to look at it.
As it is, you have to play a little risk.
So let me ask you this. What percentage are you willing to take of a likelihood of a nuclear conflict to keep your big boy pants on and say, well, we can't be bullied? 30% likelihood of nuclear attack, you say, still worth it. We can't be bullied.
Yeah.
That's insane. That's literally insane.
You have to, sometimes you have to risk. We risked it back in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
No, that's insanity.
You have
a 30% chance of the end of the world because you want to put a bully in their place. It's
chance of
fucking
the
crazy.
end of the world if North Korea decides they want Texas after they build up a nuclear arsenal. Do we just say, oh, okay, you can have Texas because there's a 30% chance that you might nuke and we might end the world here.
I think that those are completely disparate situations. On one, you're saying if North Korea says, we want Texas, give it to us now or we will launch a nuke, should we comply? Versus, should we be engaged in steps to intentionally provoke Russia, engaging in a proxy war, then putting a no-fly zone, boots on the ground, etc., with a 30% chance that that would lead to nuclear war, and say, yeah, we think we should do it because we don't want to be bullied. Those are completely disparate situations.
It is exactly the same thing.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It would be the same as saying this. It'd be like saying, on one hand, what if a bully came to you and said, I'm taking your wife. She's mine now. Would you be willing to fight to the death over that? Versus what if a bully said, I'm taking this parking spot. Would you be willing to fight to the death over that? There are two completely different situations.
Well, how are they... They're not really two different situations when that would encourage the next bully to say, I'm taking your wife.
Is the next bully... Okay, so let me ask you this. How confident are you that the next bully won't ever do anything bad? So you think by the fact that we're sending this money to Ukraine, now North Korea would never provoke us. Now China would never... They'll never do it because they're seeing... I mean, that would be belied by the fact that we see North Korea
boots
testing...
on the ground in Ukraine.
Okay, so then we put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Now all of a sudden China's like, oh shit, we'll never do anything the United States doesn't like now.
Well,
that's
they
not
think
true.
Twice.
No, it's not true. They would already think twice. We're a nuclear armed superpower.
Well,
right?
China's a paper tiger as well.
Okay, then who are you worried about being the next big baddie that will bully us if we don't, have a 30% chance of a nuclear war?
Honestly,
if China can't do it.
If what I think is going to happen on a global scale, India.
So you're predicting that if we don't lead to a what's the word? 30%.
India is one of the few countries without a major demographic issue. And again, you're gonna
I can't comprehend saying it is worth to take a 30% chance in a nuclear war that quite likely could eliminate life on this earth as we know it. 30% chance, because hypothetically, if we don't, years down the road, India could piss us off.
Or North Korea, or there's Iran, for instance.
I just think that, I would think that you understand the horrors of what nuclear annihilation is, right?
Well, yeah, I studied nuclear physics in college. That's what my degree is in. And I was also trained on the B-61 tactical nuclear warhead and deployment. So, yeah, I'm very aware of it.
Ask you this. Do you think if Russia adapted the same mentality you have, right, and they said, we need to stand up to bullies even if it means the end of the world, how do you think that would go?
I'm not say
like, for example, they might say, our ally Assad is having his nation's sovereignty violated by an invading country of the United States who has boots on the ground there against his country's will. So Russia might say, we can't stand no more. This is bullying. And if we don't stop them now, they're going to keep on bullying. And so if that means nuclear war, so be it. How do you think that mentality would play out?
That's what's in the realm of possibility. This is we are arguing, the fact that we have diametrically opposed forces here, Russia and the U.S. That is, I hate to boil it down, but that's human nature, right? You're going to have conflict. The question is at what point do you give in to the guy that's saying you're going to do it my way?
I don't know. I don't claim to be an expert on geopolitics or foreign policy or things like that, but I think that this is a dangerous and brutally oversimplified way to view the world, which is, it's black and white. We're the good guys. They're the bullies. And if we don't stop if we don't stop the bullies now, then the bullying will never stop. So fire up the fucking nukes. Let's go. I just think that's insane. I think, to me, if this sort of mentality would be adapted by one country in the United States, it would probably predictably lead to the end of the world. But certainly, if other countries that are powerful on the other side of the ledger adapted this as well, it would certainly be the end of the world. And I think that sometimes you have to understand that saber rattling happens and that there's a give and go to these sorts of things, and that there are sides that are more bad than other sides, but it's almost never black and white. And it's not worth being like, we find this so heinous. We find it so heinous what's happening in Ukraine that fuck it, let's do World War III, let's do nukes. I think that that's insanity, especially if we have the two things going, which you've already conceded to. The first is that you think the government should be acting for the interest of the United States citizens as its a priori issue. And secondly, that Russia has proved that they don't even have a chance to go into NATO countries anyways because their military is so poor. And so given those two things, to take a 30% chance of a nuclear war to protect the United States citizens from what exactly? Not going into Poland?
I don't think there's anywhere near a 30% chance of a global strategic level nuclear war even if we went boots on the ground in Ukraine. The reason for that is, sure, there might be some tactical weapon use. However, part of going on the boots on the ground no fly zone would be taking out the vast majority of their nuclear weapons capability, right? Which, believe it or not, we can do these days without using nuclear weapons. We can target their weapons capacity with our conventional weapons and eliminate the majority of that threat.
I mean, you trust this administration to do
equipment. They wouldn't even know that it's happening until the bombs were exploding.
You trust this administration to do that. This administration that was so embarrassed by Afghanistan that they made the Taliban one of the biggest air forces in the
No.
Right. But that's what you're suggesting.
Not.
Okay.
Do I trust some of the generals to do it? Yeah. Do I trust Milley to do it? No.
Okay, but that's who's there. You don't get to pick and choose. You're saying boots on the ground now.
Right.
You don't get to be like, well, it'll be Patton
I see what you're saying.
Right. It's not going to be Patton and Rommel.
Sure. Bring back Mattis, please.
You think Mattis did a great job?
Mad Dog.
Yeah, he did. He did great in Afghanistan too. He's terrible. Sold Trump out as well.
Mad Dog's good.
It's terrible. Sellout. He's Mad Dog. He got given a nickname by Trump, and everyone's like, "That's impressive." He had some cool sounding, talking points. But what did he do? What was his major accomplishment in Afghanistan?
Well, there was no win in Afghanistan. I don't care how good of a damn general you are.
Well, sometimes a good general, if there's no win, admits there's no win and comes back, right? He didn't. Mattis didn't.
But the NCA is the one that gives you the orders.
So, again, let's say that that's true. Wouldn't they still be giving orders when it comes to somehow the same group that basically got their ass handed to them by goat farmers in Afghanistan? Now they're going to be able to put boots on the ground, a no-fly zone, and disable all nuclear capabilities of Russia at the same time.
There's a huge difference between fighting a guerrilla war like we did in Afghanistan and fighting a traditional Generation 4 warfare battlefield.
Well, that's true. Right? But that's not what you're suggesting. That's not what you're comparing. You're not saying fighting a conventional war against Russia. You are saying that they will be able to clandestinely destroy the nuclear capabilities of Russia. So that even if they tried to attack us with nukes, that they would be unable to do that. Right? That's very difficult. That's not the same as Desert Storm, where we had insane superiority in every way possible and engaged in very sound tactics to win that war. That's a completely different
insane superiority in every way possible.
Okay. How'd that work out in Afghanistan?
This is a hypothetical. If we have the leadership that can build a strategy and utilize proper tactics and strategy to execute that, like we did in Desert Storm, right? Like we did in Iraq, in the war part of Iraq, not the follow-up, not the nation building. We suck at nation building, right? Yeah, we absolutely could. We have the technical capability to eliminate the vast majority of Russia's strategic weapons.
Prove it.
And we have ballistic missile defense that could handle the rest. Right?
Prove it. Show me the country where it's happened before.
What? What do you mean?
I mean, show me when the United States has gone up against a nuclear-armed superpower and was able to flawlessly... Right, we never have. So where's your confidence come from?
And it's the same people. Flawless. There's no such thing as flawless in a military operation.
And so when you're talking about the largest nuclear arsenal in the world and being like, well, we got 80% of them, small comfort to the hundreds of millions that die.
Okay, hey, I wanna jump in here really quick. Hey, hang on, Twisted. There's something that's getting talked around in this entire past 20 minutes I want to steer the conversation towards this because this is something that's being talked around. Let's say the conflict escalates. We put boots on the ground. We bomb a bunch of Russia's facilities. That will constitute a major commitment of military resources and hardware. And that will be the time where the U.S. has been weakest in a very long time. What assurance do we have that if we commit a bunch of extra resources to this war and actually go all in on this, that China does not say, now's the time to strike? And then we have to worry about not only Russia, but China, North Korea, and several other of their corollary assets.
Well, my question is where is China going to strike? They don't have the sea lift capacity to conduct an expeditionary war.
They would probably strike Taiwan.
They could strike into Russia.
They would probably strike Taiwan.
They don't have the sea lift capacity to strike Taiwan. They have a billion men, but they don't have an amphibious assault capability right now.
Okay, so I just want to be clear. You might be right.
They're developing an amphibious assault capability, but they don't have it presently.
Okay, you might be right, but let's say that in the next year we would see that was incorrect. Would you then take back your strong-held beliefs that a 30% chance of nuclear war is worth it because the United States would be able to disable the vast majority of nuclear weapons? I mean, I don't make these definitive claims like this military absolutely could do X, and you're making a lot of those claims. And I think that that's dangerous. My default is to say we should be approaching this trying to have a peaceful resolution, that instead of facilitating war, we should be facilitating peace. But there's no incentive for the United States, NATO, or Zelensky to do that.
I absolutely would like to see peace. I'd like to see peace in Ukraine. I'd like to see China not try to flex its muscles, China is not going to be an issue in coming decades, but
it could. Again, you're getting this from Peter Zan. We'll see, right? For example, France just came out. Macron just came out and signaled that he's absolutely willing to work with China, right? We have the BRICS nations that are trying to usurp the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Lula in Brazil just said that we need to end the United States dollar as the reserve currency. Now, even if militaristically you're right and that no country could do anything, the United States go wherever the fuck they want, no one could do anything, despite the fact they got their ass kicked by goat farmers in Afghanistan. But we'll ignore that, right? Let's say that you're right, that that no one would be able to do anything.
Disingenuous, because the United States did not really get its ass kicked by goat farmers in Afghanistan.
It did. We outnumbered the Afghans. The Afghan security forces and the United States military in Afghanistan outnumbered the Taliban 3-1. Is that correct?
Well, full guerrilla war like that, and
no, that's not what happened. No. That's misrepresenting the situation. So we outnumbered 3-1, had superior technology, superior training, etc. Right? You would agree with that?
Well, yeah. However, superior training and superior technology does not really help you in the type of war that Afghanistan was.
That might be true, but that's not what I'm talking about.
There's a huge difference between fighting a war such as Afghanistan and a real, warfare like we fought in Iraq in Desert Storm, like we fought in World War II, like we fought in Iraq during Iraqi freedom, during the war portion, the invasion portion, like we fought in Korea, like we fought in World War I. Big difference between that and insurgency action like we ran into Afghanistan. Same thing that happened in Vietnam. Sure, it's called asymmetrical warfare. It's not a matter of getting your ass kicked. It's a matter of you. It is difficult to impossible to suppress an insurgency through conventional military action.
All right, so two things going to that. One, you're comparing something that I'm not discussing. I'm not saying that having an insurgency and being able to occupy a country in perpetuity isn't a difficult thing. That's not what I'm criticizing. What I'm criticizing is the absolute abysmal failure in one of the most disastrous militaristic things I've ever seen a superpower do, in the fact that it took 3 days once we left to have to beg our enemy of 20 years for protection. U.S. service people died, people hanging off of airplanes trying to escape, people that we weren't doing background checks getting on these airplanes, leaving weapons to our hostile enemies to the tunes of billions of dollars worth of weapons. That's not the same as, oh, but I'm saying that we got our ass kicked in the 20 years there that we weren't able to eliminate the Taliban. So that's number one. I'm talking about the withdrawal. It's not just, oh, we couldn't completely wipe out the Taliban. Yeah. It's how bad that's number one. Now let me number two. Number two is this. The job that we were there for was never to stay there in perpetuity. We weren't told by the generals. It was to train a competent security force, not to eliminate the Taliban, but to be able to control the seats of power in Afghanistan after we left. We gave them superior technology. We gave them training for 20 years. They outnumbered the Taliban 3-1. They lost in 3 days. Not they were unable to wipe out an insurgency.
Well,
the seat of power. Please, let me finish. Please.
Laid down the weapons and ran away. They didn't even fight the battle.
That doesn't discount what Rob just said, though.
Right. So what I'm saying is that this training for 20 years for the most superior military force in the history of this world, that for 20 years to the tune of $1 trillion was arming and training a force that was 3 times larger. It wasn't about eliminating an insurgency. It was about being able to control the seats of power after they left. And they were so bad that you're right, they fled in 3 days. That's what happened. That's what I mean by getting our ass kicked, that we had to beg our mortal enemy that we were fighting there for 20 years to protect us on the way out. And the people we were training that our generals told us for 20 years were doing great. It was going to go good. We're so bad.
It matters to me personally that there's a difference. The ANA got their asses kicked. We did not.
I don't think that the service people that were there fighting, like my friends, should be denigrated in any way whatsoever. I am saying that the leadership failed so abysmally in their planning that our leadership got their ass kicked. Similarly, I wouldn't mock soldiers that fought in Vietnam for the fact that we ended up not winning that conflict. I would say the fact that we were.
You would. Sorry, you thought that was what I was saying. I didn't think you would. Right. I know you support our vets, man.
Yeah. But again, Vietnam's another issue. We were lied to that war with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and then it was disaster. But the point I'm trying to make is I don't know where this confidence in leadership comes from. Right? Like, it's different. It's not as if you're saying, like, listen, if it came down to it and the United States lined troops up on one end of the field and Russia lined them up on the other, U.S. is going to win that 100 out of 100 times. Totally agree. That's not what we're talking about. You're saying that the U.S. is so superior, not just the troops, not just the technology, but the leadership that's existed there for at least the last 20 years. And certainly the leadership we see now under people like General Milley, that they are so competent that they would be able to deter any aggression from any country in the world, including China going into a place like Taiwan, while simultaneously fighting a war in Ukraine with boots on the ground, while simultaneously destroying all capabilities of nuclear weapons of Russia. I don't believe that. I just think that there's no evidence for that. I think that that's propaganda. I think that we get this pie in the sky, just like Russia's propaganda, right? The Russian people probably thought, like, we're the baddest, man. We'll run through Ukraine in like 20 hours. We'll be back at home for, borscht and vodka. It didn't go that way, right? I think that what you find is that war is very difficult and deterrence is very difficult. Yeah. But the other thing is this. I don't even have to prove that. Like, to Zach's question, here's the deal, right? Let's say that China doesn't invade Taiwan. Well, let's just say that boots on the ground stretches us thin, that we lose. You're aware of the fact that, like, when it comes to geopolitical influence, we have what's called hard power, which is our ability to project militaristically. Sure. And then we have soft power, which is our sort of, diplomacy, right? What if boots on the ground harms us diplomatically to the countries we already see signaling affectations towards China, such as Brazil and France and perhaps India and perhaps, like, what if all of a sudden more people say, well, this is too much? Now there's boots on the ground. We were told that there wasn't an escalation like that was going to occur. So what if all of a sudden the end result of that is, well, okay, China never invades anywhere, but the dollar loses its status as the world reserve currency. Worth it?
Rob, if you could answer just a really quick question. What if somebody engages the U.S. Marines?
If we put boots on the ground in Ukraine and someone engages?
If somebody says, hey, fuck you, Marines, and then the Marines engage, what happens next?
I don't know what you mean. So, like, we have Marines stationed in Texas, and China's government says, fuck you, Marines, and attacks them. I would expect that to be a war. Or
Marines
if you're
can do anything, literally anything, for 72 hours without congressional approval. What happens next?
So your argument is, if we...
No, I'm not arguing anything. I'm just asking.
I would say it would depend on the situation. If a Marine's raping someone and someone attacks them, I don't think that we'll engage in nuclear war to prevent that.
I don't think there's rape involved.
Okay, so if a Marine decides that they're going to shoot Chinese citizens, or they're going to shoot Chinese military, or they're going to shoot Russian military, and there's an action against them, I don't think that it justifies starting World War III. You tell me, what are you saying? One Marine's vacationing in South Korea, and a South Korean soldier shoots him in the head, and the South Korean government's like, we're not going to punish them. We nuke them?
Sorry, Rob.
It's all right.
I muted him because he's not supposed to be butting in.
Well, yeah, I'm happy. I don't mind. Like, it's not like an official debate that people are keeping score or anything. So if he had something to add, that's fine. As long as Twisted Aviator is cool with it, I'm fine with that.
All right.
But
well, I know Grumple, and I know he's just going to interrupt with incessant memeing, because I would do that as well if I were in Grumple's position.
I don't even know that that's true, by the way. It's something I've never heard of, that the idea that, like, Marines could go rogue, and it's just like, oh, they don't have to follow orders for 72.
Actually, the president can utilize the Marine Corps for 72 hours without congressional approval.
Well, that's the president ordering them to do something. That's different than them on their own. So you're telling me if, like, 100 Marines just on their own said, fuck it, we're invading Canada, and they roll in there shooting and hollering, and then Canada fights back, now we're at war.
Order. No,
well, right, then it's not, well, then that's different. So then the idea is, if President Biden sends Marines to take an action that results in a country firing at them, well, that's a similar question to if, you know, what happened. For example, we saw U.S. soldiers in Syria just the other day were targeted, right?
Right.
What should be the end result of that? How would the United States feel if China had a base in Texas, right? And how would we feel? We'd probably not like that. We'd probably say, leave or we're attacking you, right? Well, that's what's happening in Syria, right? And so the question is, well, what do you do then? Well, they were attacked. Well, yeah, sometimes you have to take defensive stances. You could say the same thing about Iraq. Many people say we shouldn't still be there. But then we had Iran attack them, and then Trump assassinated Soleimani, right? Was that the right thing to do? I don't know. The better thing would have not been there in the first place. But if we put our soldiers in active conflict zones, and then they're attacked, and we get the vapors, and we're like, well, now that's it. That's exactly the reason I don't want to put boots on the ground. Because if they're there and then they get attacked, even if it's an accident, then you would have people in the United States saying, well, that's an act of war. Now we're in World War III. And the other side's going to say, but we're justified. You're there providing militaristic support with boots on the ground to try to basically destroy our country, or to stop us in this war. So we consider that a hostile act of war. You're not an innocent civilian. You're a hostile army that's operating against us, and so we treat you like a hostile army. Both sides would have credibility in that. That's why I don't want to be in the position where we have that situation that's likely to occur. Because once boots are on the ground, it's going to escalate.
Measured response is a thing. However, measured response can absolutely lead to escalation. Meaning that if Russia attacked boots on the ground people, U.S. military in Ukraine, a measured response might be to conduct an airstrike on a target in Russia. Target.
I think
Could that lead to escalation? Yes. However, measured response is a thing. That's a practice that has been done in low intensity conflict for decades, centuries even.
Let me ask you a question. Is Russia using air support in their war in Ukraine?
Should we be doing air support for
them? No. Is Russia currently using air support for their invasion of Ukraine?
At a very minimal level, primarily because we've given
But
Ukraine
they
air
are,
defense systems.
But they are, right?
Yes.
Okay, when you say that we should have boots on the ground and a no-fly zone over Ukraine, what happens when Russia flies a plane over Ukraine?
You shoot it down. That's what a no-fly zone is.
That's World War III.
But you also have to be willing to shoot down Ukrainian aircraft, too. A no-fly zone is literally that, no-fly.
That would literally be World War III.
I'm not. If I may, I'm not seeing the leap in logic there, because there have already been escalations between Ukraine and between the U.S. and Russia. Obviously, we have the leak that we now know we have U.S. boots on the ground. That's an escalation. We still haven't seen the full-on World War III signaling, so I'm not seeing the jump in logic there, Rob.
Because it's different to have clandestine operatives that they'll be able to have some sort of like comment. They'll say, well, these special forces that were on the ground, they weren't actually firing upon Russians. They weren't doing that. They were just there training. And Russia already knows that, right? That's different than the United States military announcing, we now occupy this country. And if you fly aircraft carrier, we will shoot them down. Russia will look at that as literally a declaration of war. So that's different than we happen to have 1,000 people there. That's literally, in Russia's eye, a declaration of war. Similarly, if
understandable, I see your point.
If Russia was like, we're going to station troops in Canada and institute a no-fly zone over Canada, and if United States aircraft comes into Canada, we're shooting it down. That's an act of war. The United States would correctly say that is an act of war.
I got you.
And that's why I'm saying that it would. That's different than there were 500.
Really, there's a difference between, and I can't say how Russia would respond. They might use it as a casus belli to declare war, right? But there's a difference between defending against an invading air force, being if Russia flew into Ukraine, and setting up a no-fly or versus going into foreign airspace as an act of war.
You could say there's a difference, but it wouldn't be to Russia. It might be to the international community. And again, if that's true, then your justification, you would also give the justification for Russia right now to bomb the shit out of U.S. soldiers in Syria. Any way you look at it, right, the fact that after the Crimea invasion, right, and all of that settled down, the fact that the ally of Russia had their country invaded in their eyes by the United States was a priori to any sorts of Russia invasion of Ukraine this time around. So Russia would always be able to say, well, if that's the standard,
Crimea. But
well, if that's the standard, Russia would say, right, well, if that's the standard, that if there's a hostile invading force, then the other countries are allowed to come in and say, no fly zone, will kill your military. That's exactly what would be going on in Syria. Now, how would the United States government and citizens react to that? If you have family that's stationed in Syria, that's some of the thousands of troops there, and you found out they all got bombed to death, and Russia said, hey, we told you you were the invader, so we're justified. That's different. That's not how it would be looked at in the United States. The United States would say that's an act of war. You could have approached us in various other ways to try to get us to move these troops, but instead you just bombed them, or you declared a no-fly zone and shot down our airplanes. We all know that's the standard that would be applied. We all know it. That's exactly what would be done.
Well, now we're getting into the politics of alliances and where, is Syria an actual ally of Russia?
But that's fair game. Of course that's fair game. This is all a very political situation. Of course that discussion's fair game.
Put it this way, right, Twisted. Let's say, even if we didn't, I think that it's evident they are, but let's say they aren't, right? Let's say that Assad and Putin, they don't even talk. They're a neutral relationship, even if that was the case. Geographically, though, when we talked about the idea of NATO expanding, and you were like, well, it's not really expanding just because countries asked to join, and then we said yes. Right outside now the border, we see, right outside the border of Russia, U.S. troops on the ground, attacking another country, saying, yeah, this country's corrupt, we need to come in here. You see Ukraine, which used to be an ally of Russia. Then in 2014, regardless
if Ukraine was not an ally of Russia.
You don't think the Yanukovych regime was an ally of Russia?
No.
That's not what the Obama State Department says.
I think they were Russian leaning, but I don't think they were an ally. I think Ukraine just wanted to stay independent.
No, that is not what any of the U.S. State Department said.
Sure.
So, for example, Paul Manafort went to jail in part because he lobbied for Yanukovych, who we're told in the indicting documents was a, quote, pro-Russian president of Ukraine. That's what the indicting document said. Right? So the idea that it's like, well, he wasn't really pro. Yanukovych was seen at the United States message was
pro-Russia.
Okay.
Sure.
Right.
But
so then the
that doesn't
governmental
make him
leadership
an
of
ally.
Okay. I guess
maybe I'm getting too
friend?
warm
shoulder to cry on?
An ally. Just like Ukraine is not an ally of the United States.
Fair enough. A friendly nation who was engaged in friendly diplomacy, right? Fair enough. Then we'll say maybe the word ally has a specific font.
Maybe.
I will say friendly nation to them. So we took their neighboring nation that was formerly in a country with them and now was just friendly with them, so much so that the United States said that the president of that nation was pro-Russian, whatever term we want to use to say that. And that was replaced with someone who is now pro-United States and is basically a puppet of Obama.
Okay.
And then another friendly nation right on the border of Russia in Syria with Assad, they get invaded by the United States. So how's Russia supposed to look at this?
Well, we didn't invade Ukraine when
we invaded Assad. We invaded Syria.
Right, but you're equating Syria to Ukraine. We didn't invade Ukraine.
No, I'm not.
The people
saying
of Ukraine decided they didn't want to be aligned with the Russians.
Not to Russia's.
Russians.
We already went through this, not to Russia's perspective. The people of Ukraine, many of them, for example, right? Let's use a situation that maybe the audience would understand better. Do you think there was a groundswell of people that were absolutely furious that Trump was elected in 2016?
Probably, yeah.
But there were riots. There were people.
Sure.
Millions of people, right, were furious, right? Now, let's say that happened, but it didn't result in anything untoward. It didn't result in like emergency elections happening. We could agree with that. I think that there was a coup, but it was different. It was right. Now let's say instead of that, China funded a bunch of NGOs, right? And now with these billions upon billions of dollars coming in, it was able to create the narrative that was strong enough that instead of like 30% of the population feeling that, now it was 65%. And this resulted in a movement that had emergency elections, and it got Donald Trump removed, and instead we got Hillary Clinton put in. Do you think that it would be a fair statement to say China interfered in our system, and now they have some? Wouldn't you, as someone who probably didn't like Hillary Clinton, say that's insane? A hostile foreign government is putting people in positions of power, particularly then if Hillary Clinton comes out to be like, I'm pro-China. I'm gonna help China all the time. Wouldn't you say that that seems like foreign interference?
Well, yeah, I think there was foreign interference in both 2016 and 2020.
Okay, but the point I'm trying to make is, now let's look at the situation in Ukraine. You're like, well, it was organic. People in the country were upset. That's true, just like people in the country were upset in the United States. But the question is, would it have been successful if it were not for the meddling of foreign countries and NGOs? We don't know. But to Russia's perspective, they're going to say, that's still interference. They're still going to say, okay, so just whether it achieved success because of the United States, or the United States did everything in their power to make sure it achieved success, but it would have anyways, Russia's still going to be like, that's interference. You took a friendly leader that was friendly with us, and you replaced them with a puppet of a hostile foreign nation that's our greatest enemy.
Let me ask you a question. Like me, you say you want what's in America's best interest, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Having Ukraine pro-U.S. with their natural resources and their proximity to Russia, a rival, if not straight up enemy of the United States, having Ukraine pro-U.S. is that not in the U.S.'s best interest?
Two things. I'll answer your question directly after this. One, I said that I want what's best for the government to operate what's best of the interests of the United States, but to not do intentional harm to other countries. So a similar argument could be made, well, shouldn't we just go into Venezuela and take them out and take all their natural resources? Wouldn't that be better for you? Maybe economically, but we still shouldn't do that. I don't cheer for doing that level. But even if we forego that, right? I don't know that it is better for it. Depends. Not if we end up in World War III. Then it wouldn't have been better, right? At some point, you have to say, well, wait a minute. Yeah, I'm sure it would be great for the United States if every country freely elected people that said, you know what, let's tax our people 50% and send 25% of the money to the great people of the United States. Sure, that'd be great for me. It's not realistic, but that would be great, right? But the question is, at what point, if it requires U.S. meddling that increases hostilities, right? Okay, so now the Ukraine, what big benefit did I get from Poroshenko winning in Ukraine in 2014? Well, the United States government sent billions of dollars, and then they forced the prosecutor to get fired that was looking at the vice president's son. And then the vice president's son and a bunch of Democratic politicians got tons of money. And then the Ukrainian parliamentarians interfered in the election to try to stop my candidate, Donald Trump, from winning. So was it worth it? I don't think so. I don't see what the benefit was.
I see it as being there being a benefit with the Ukrainians being aligned with the United States. Because of what I said, natural resources and
but organically that's a different question though. Like again, the question of
the organic movement away from Russia was a majority movement in Ukraine. I do not believe that it was 30%, like you said on your hypothetical here. I do believe that the majority of the Ukrainians were pro-Western versus pro-Russian.
It doesn't matter what you think. What matters is what Russia thinks. And we already said that there's a high likelihood that Russia might think, we don't think this would have achieved success without the interference of outside NGOs and groups like the United States, right? And the question is...
I didn't say a high likelihood. I conceded that it was possible.
Well, I would say that you're wrong. I would say that there's a high likelihood that Russia thinks that because Russia's publicly said so. So I don't think that you don't think that Russia's like, oh, okay, United States NGOs are pumping millions of dollars in here, and these NGOs are facilitating protests and riots. You think that Russia's like, yeah, we're not going to blame the United States for that. I don't. I think that whether they rightfully or wrongfully, they're going to put the blame on the United States. Maybe you're right. Maybe this would have achieved a revolution without the interference of the United States or NGOs. But it happened. And what I'm telling you is, in this, if your hypothetical situation, when it comes to, I mean, you might as well say this about people. Wouldn't you rather that guy be your friend than your enemy? Sure, right? Wouldn't you rather that country be your friend than your enemy? Absolutely. But if it's at the cost of increasing hostile relationships with even more powerful countries, maybe not. Maybe that's not a good thing. Again, we could say Saddam Hussein was, Muammar Gaddafi was a bad dude. Yep. And so wouldn't it be better to have someone there that wasn't Muammar Gaddafi, that someone that was more friendly to us? Sure, I guess that would be better. Cool, we'll take him out. Oh, now there's open air slave markets. Well, hypothetically, wouldn't it have been better to have someone who liked us more than Gaddafi? I guess. But the question is, at what point do we moralistically have the right?
There's always that possibility of someone worse, right? That's why I don't encourage the idea of let's go in and use a B-2 and take out Putin in his bunker, right? Because there's always that possibility of somebody worse coming to power.
Well, that's true, but it's not even that.
That's why we have a prescription against, basically, assassination through military action.
We have a rich history of. We have a rich history of color revolutions that not only included assassinations, but also militaristic overthrowings, paying for freedom fighters, aka terrorists, to commit acts of violence against governmental officials and civilians. So I mean, the CIA does not have clean hands in this, but it's even more than just the threat of
the vast majority of that was during the Cold War, and the Cold War was. Man, that's a whole nother discussion that,
But you already admitted, right, when the Cold War ended, when did the wall come down?
91.
91. Okay. You admitted things are getting worse when it comes to corruption of these organizations. So it hasn't been that long.
Well, it depends on what kind of corruption you mean. Do I think that we're out there overthrowing governments like we did during the Cold War? No.
Sorry, when the wall came down, that wasn't when the Cold War ended. Just FYI.
Well, yeah, I get it, but it symbolically sort of was the beginning of the end.
Well, the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, I believe it was.
Gaddafi, we overthrew him, right? Overthrowing through a color revolution that's not necessarily an assassination or something like that, still overthrowing. That absolutely is happening. Hell, it looks like we're involved in Zimbabwe right now. in their elections. It looks like we were involved in Brazil's elections. When I say we, I mean the CIA in the United States. So it certainly happens. The United States is constantly putting its thumb on the scale, the leadership of countries. They don't want Erdogan anymore. They don't want him, right? So, I mean, it's certainly the case. I don't know. Maybe not, but that's the question. The point I was trying to make is this. It's not just a matter of we shouldn't do this because a worse person could come along. There is a question of morally, are we justified? I keep saying we. Is the United States government justified in saying we know what's best for us and for people around the world, and so we will interfere, and we'll make sure the people we want are elected? Are we justified in doing that? You might say in certain extreme situations like Hitler or Frank,
yes,
or okay, so Yanukovych, Assad,
I believe
Gaddafi?
Yanukovych, yes, we would have been justified. I don't think we did. But
see, that's the worst of it. If you think that, then you surely
government directly did. NGOs are different than government.
Well, not if they're primarily financed and given their mission by the government. I mean, it's.
I want to ask for. Let me stop.
Well, I think
this term NGO keeps getting thrown around. Can you clarify that for anyone who doesn't know, included myself, what that is?
Non-governmental organization.
Non-governmental organization. Thank you.
So, like, for example, in Ukraine, a lot of the stuff, I have debates all the time about the original impeachment of Trump, right? And the idea that we had this prosecutor by the name of Viktor Shokin, it was the head prosecutor in Ukraine, right? And he was fired because Joe Biden issued a quid pro quo that said we're not going to give the government of Ukraine $1 billion of our tax dollars. They're not going to give it unless this guy's fired. And the narrative was basically, well, he wasn't investigating Burisma, Joe Biden's son's company. So this would be, we're supposed to believe that a father was like, I'm furious that my son's company's not being investigated enough, so I will fire the prosecutor. And then it went to the NABU, which was basically the FBI of Ukraine that was completely financed by the United States government, that people like George Kent at the U.S. State Department admitted in writings they told the NABU when to stop prosecuting NGOs that were beneficial to them. So you would think, oh, well, then now that it's in the ally of the Obama State Department, now they're going to prosecute this pro-Russian oligarch that's the head of Zlochevsky, that's the head of Burisma. Nope, they let him go. Isn't that odd? Now, the reason I bring this up is most of the writings that you see, people say, Viktor Shokin was corrupt, and Viktor Shokin was doing this, and this. And you'll see this like in the New York Times, or you'll see it in Politico. And it'll always cite this organization in Ukraine that's called the Anti-Corruption Action Center. That's an NGO, the Anti-Corruption Action Center. Who funds the Anti-Corruption Action Center? Well, the Obama administration funded them, and George Soros' Open Society funded them. That's who funds them. So this was an organization that Shokin, the prosecutor, was actually investigating. And George Kent wrote to them and said, look, we finance them. We think this is all a huge mistake. It'd be a shame if you keep investigating them. So a group that was being investigated, an NGO that's financed by the Obama State Department, financed by George Soros' organizations, was being investigated by the country of Ukraine. And basically the United States said, hey, if you like that money you're getting from us, you're going to stop investigating our ally. So when we say NGO, there's this argument that people on the left want to make all the time where they're like, well, that's not a government entity. In fact, it says non-governmental organization. Right, but if their primary source of funding is coming from government agencies, it hardly makes a material difference. And you can't say, well, the United States didn't involve, this group that the United States paid got involved. But that's the sort of semantical tricks. I'm not saying that Twisted's doing that, but that's the sort of stuff that the United States says. Like, I'll give you another example if you guys are interested.
I'm talking more from an international law perspective. An NGO is not a government organization.
True, but can you see how that could be exploited to take governmental actions and then say, well, the law says this is legitimate.
That's the whole purpose of an NGO. Is to take plausible deniability is the whole purpose of an NGO.
Right. Let me give you an example similar to this. It doesn't have to do with NGOs. Yeah. This whistleblower, this Teixeira guy that just broke all these documents about Ukraine, right? Do you know how they found him? Right? They found news organizations found him. So imagine the New York Times at the time of the Pentagon Papers hunting down the leaker instead of, oh my God, look at what these papers say, right? That's what happened. And Mike Cernovich was talking about this, and I think it's right. What happened was that our intelligence agencies wanted this guy, and they're able to use all sorts of tactics that aren't legal, but they didn't want that to show up in a trial, so they said, well, we'll give this information to the media, and then the media will find him. We didn't do it. The government didn't do it. It was just independent media groups that did it. So you can't point the finger at the FBI. It's the same type of shit that the CIA does. The CIA says, we're not responsible. We didn't do it. It was just this organization that we created and funded. But it wasn't us.
I'm kind of the opinion of do what you need to do to capture somebody who's committing treason, whether that be this guy or what's his face, Snowden.
Assange, right?
Assange. I mean, were there pieces of information that Snowden had that is good that we know about? Sure. But he also put a lot of people at risk.
I completely disagree. This would be a debate for another day, but even if I would agree with you, can't you see how
on a tangent?
That's all right. That's what makes these sorts of debates best, right? But I think that even if I would agree with you, which I don't, but even if I did, the obvious selective double standard in how these things are gone after, right, shows that I would never support it anyways. For example, anybody that leaked against Donald Trump was a hero. They were a whistleblower. You couldn't even say their name if they were outed. Social media companies would censor you from doing that. These people deserve statues. They're the greatest people.
Massive double standard there. I'm not going to argue that whatsoever.
So then why support it? So like, this is something that like frustrates me. So people will say, well, I think this guy committed treason, so he should go to jail. Okay, what about the leakers of Trump? What about the ones that leaked the phone calls? Well, I guess they should have went to jail, but they didn't. At what point do you say like, no? If the standard's going to be that people that leak
should have gone to jail.
Right, but you don't understand.
Should have gone to jail. Snowden should have gone to jail. Assange is in jail. This guy should go to jail. If you leak secret information, classified information, you should go to jail. You sign. When you get a security clearance, you sign.
You are the greatest. You are the greatest
data.
You are the greatest ally to the very corrupt institutions that you criticize. Do you realize that?
Well, there are things that need to remain secret.
But I'm saying that you, knowing that there is a double standard in how this is enforced, and yet still cheering for when people that leak things that embarrass the very corrupt institutions that you would say that you don't support, such as the Biden administration, and you say, that's okay, he should go to jail. I cheer that on. And then when I'm like, what about the people that, well, they should have went to jail too. The Biden administration goes, this is what the Biden administration is doing. This is what the Biden administration does. Thank you, Twisted. You're right. You're right. Because what you're doing is you're playing the game for them. This would be no different in the Jim Crow South, right? If you were like, here's a town that's 50% black and 50% white, and yet 100% of jaywalking convictions have been against black people, right? And you'd say, yeah, those black people should go to jail for jaywalking. They absolutely should. And I guess the white people should have too. And the white people will go, I agree. And then they'll still not send them to jail. And you'll still be cheering on, hey, they arrested. At some point, you have to say the double standard means that the crime is less important than the selective prosecution of it. That's a bigger deal. A corrupt FBI, a corrupt intelligence agencies that will engage in coups against candidates they don't like and go as aggressive as possible against anyone that's seen as technically or explicitly committing any sort of crime that they think endangers them, while simultaneously protecting the very people that committed the same crimes that benefited them, is far worse than any of the alleged crimes that this Teixeira guy or Snowden or Assange committed.
A corrupt FBI is the singular thing that's going to motivate people to like actually do stuff.
What's that?
Please. A corrupt FBI is the singular thing that's going to actually motivate people to like get involved and like be active.
Are you asking if that's what I think, or you're saying that?
I'm saying it, and do you agree or like?
I think it is.
I'm gonna mute up again.
That's all right. I think it's the single most important thing. We might have discussions, for example, on what we should do with Ukraine, but these discussions hardly matter at the end of the day if our vote doesn't matter, because there are institutions that are never-ending powers, such as the Department of State, the FBI, the CIA, DHS, etc., that make these decisions, and they don't give a shit what we think, and they basically control the outcomes of our elections. And so until we end that corruption, pretty much nothing else matters. That's why I'm almost a single issue voter on disband the FBI, go after these corrupt people as hard as possible. Will this motivate people? I don't know. We'll see. I think there are specific things about the corruption that will. Let me give you an example. I live in rural Pennsylvania. My neighbor, technically not my neighbor, my in-law's neighbor, is a farmer. When I talk to him about, like, dude, let me tell you about Victor Shokin, and let me tell you about Zlochevsky and Hunter Biden and John Kerry's son and, Lutsenko and Poroshenko, the dude's just like, whoop, whatever, dude, right? But if I say this, hey, Jeffrey Epstein raped a bunch of kids, sexually trafficked them with a bunch of probably politicians and world leaders in a bunch of fields, and they're burying that he gets. He understands that. And that also has to do with FBI corruption. So the ways in which we talk about these things can be the primary motivator in ending that corruption, but it's not a foregone conclusion. I mean, I don't know. Even if you take conservatives, I have a hard time selling to people that this is the biggest issue. They might be more concerned with Dylan Mulvaney on a beer can. So I don't know. And I'm not even saying that that's not something to be concerned
and
about.
I think that's where we're coming from is, to me, the risk posed to our military and intelligence personnel, the individuals on the ground through these leakers, is more dangerous than the leakers of Trump's information not being prosecuted. I think it's just two different viewpoints.
Says who?
That's my opinion. Your opinion is it is.
Okay, well, here's my opinion. That had Trump been president, we wouldn't have seen Russia invade, which would have meant hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians wouldn't have died. And so the leaks against him directly resulted in hundreds of thousands of people being killed. How many people have been killed as a result of these?
Ukraine did, or why Russia did this at this time, is because Biden was perceived as weak.
Would be true. So then those leaks would have been
it's the same reason that Crimea was taken under the Obama administration, right?
So you amend your point that the leaks of Trump were less dangerous than the leaks of Biden. I disagree. They resulted in hundreds of thousands of people potentially dying, as opposed to how many people were going to die because this Teixeira guy admitted that there were boots on the ground?
Who knows? Depends on how Russia reacts.
Now, that's true. But if Russia reacts, that disproves basically the majority of your thesis that we should have put boots on the ground in the first place. Right? So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't in this.
Well, when I was talking boots on the ground, I believe that we should have done that from the start. When Russia started building up troops on the border of Ukraine, we should have put troops in Ukraine like we did in Saudi Arabia, right? During when Hussein was lining up on the border of Saudi Arabia.
I just disagree. Now listen, but I'm not saying
you're
that
absolutely right that Trump or another conservative that has had showing strength would have prevented this from ever happening.
Maybe. Right, but the point is this: regarding
you're right. I mean, this is all hypothetical. Everything we're talking is hypothetical, really.
Here's the thing, right? Even first off, Assange is different than Snowden and this guy, so he shouldn't be lumped in. I don't understand why you would say that he leaked and it was dangerous. But even beyond that, like, at what point? It's a serious question. Even if you're against these leaks, at what point, if we have a government that's basically working part and part, or if we have a, you call it what you want, deep state, establishment, intel institutions, state departments, these bureaucratic state that's more dangerous than Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, because those people come in and serve and then leave. But these institutions are there in perpetuity, right? That's how powerful and dangerous they are. So much so that Chuck Schumer admitted that the elected president of the United States can't criticize them because they'll find 6 ways from Sunday getting back. That's how powerful they are. And the media, which used to applaud itself for holding truth to power, now is in such a, symbiotic relationship that they're, instead of holding truth to power, they're protecting the powerful by withholding the truth. That's what they do. And so that's why you see John Brennan's contributor on CNN and James Comey, right? There's this revolving door from intel to media. And so now we see that instead of the Pentagon Papers, where there was a leaker and the press said that was one of their highest points in this country's history, giving themselves Pulitzer Prizes, talking about how important that reporting was. Now the press takes the total opposite tactic. They say, we won't report the leaks and instead we'll hunt down the leaker. At what point then, if we don't have any institution, if we have corrupt intel agencies and a corrupt media that holds secrets for them, how will we ever know if someone doesn't leak something? if we don't have a whistleblower?
Well, there are certain things that we, as a public, don't need to know.
Like that we're being lied to about the situation in Ukraine where hundreds of trillions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars are going? I think that's something we need to know.
There again, that puts in the question of what is the unintended consequences of that leak, right?
What if it results in a peaceful resolution?
Was us knowing that worth your possibility of nuclear war if Russia responds to us having soldiers in Ukraine? Is is that leak worth it?
It could easily result in the opposite. It could easily result in the United States having egg on their face and losing credibility in the international community, saying, look, enough is enough. It's time to have a peaceful resolution. So who's to say? But the point is, like, what do we do? Do we just? I don't disagree with you. Like, oftentimes there are things that we could agree should be illegal, or things that we could even say are immoral. There are bad choices, but sometimes those bad choices seem to be better than all of the other choices that are worse. And so, I'm just saying, hypothetically, if we have a system,
you're kind of proving my point of. Sometimes sometimes a bad choice is better than other choices that are worse. Not standing up to Russia, in my opinion, is a worse choice because
I disagree.
Of what that could lead to down the road.
Right. So when we got into that debate and we said, well, let's look at how far we're willing to go with this. It doesn't matter if you actually think there is a 30% chance of nuclear war. You said even if there was, you would support this. And I think that impugns your opinion in objective eyes, because I think that
30% is pretty good odds.
Yeah, especially when talking about the end of the world. Yes, I agree. That's pretty good odds. Well, so that would be something that I would.
It's not going to happen.
Oh, that's absurd, right? So, like, I know not everyone deals with it like me, but when I did policy debate in college, we used to talk about these are called impacts, bad things that could happen, right? And you would look at probability, time frame, and magnitude, right? And so how would you evaluate this? Let's say that Team A has a low magnitude impact. It will kill 10,000 people, but there's a 90% chance of it happening. But Team B is able to solve nuclear annihilation, but there's only a 40% chance of happening. Which impact is more severe? I guess the point I'm trying to make is a 30% chance of nuclear war is an incredibly high chance given the magnitude of nuclear war.
Well, I don't think it's anywhere near a 30% chance, but
even if it's not, in the sakes of two people philosophically discussing what we would like to see our government doing, if you're willing for the government, in the names of fighting bullies, to create actions that would lead up to a 30% chance of nuclear war, I think that's a disastrous philosophy.
I don't when the possibility, a greater chance of a nuclear war exists in the future if you don't stand up against that. Instead of having one country that you have a 30% chance of having a nuclear war with, what happens when North Korea has an arsenal, India has an arsenal, Pakistan, Iran has an arsenal?
Did you cheer for
30? Now you've got a 30% chance of nuclear war, not with Russia, but with Russia, Iran.
Okay, should a third-party country?
North Korea. Well, that's a 120% chance of a nuclear war. If you have a 30% chance of all of them, that's not really how probabilities work. But you get my point.
Well, let's take a third-party country, right? Let's say the U.K., right, or France or Germany. We'll say Germany. That's a good example, right? Do you think Germany should have stood up to the bullies of the United States when they invaded Iraq or they invaded Syria?
What do you mean?
I mean, United States, like Russia, has nukes, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're being a bully. They're invading. We'll just take Syria. They invaded Syria, right? Just like Russia invaded Ukraine.
Well,
so from the perspective of a third party like Germany, if they don't attack the United States, the chance of nuclear war is higher because the United States will continue to be bullies because they have nuclear weapons.
it doesn't really apply to the United States because of our conventional military power, right? It's when we're talking nuclear war, we're not going to invade Iraq because we have nukes. We invaded Iraq
I
because
don't.
we knew we.
I don't. So you're saying that
I
if
guess I'm
Russia,
not-
so if you're saying Russia had 0 nuclear weapons, they would have never invaded Ukraine.
Correct. I don't think they would have.
I think that's belied by the fact that even you admitted that Russia thought their conventional forces were far superior to Ukraine and they would have easily been able to wipe them out. And so if it's true that they did so
But
because
there would have been no deterrent to the NATO going boots on the ground in Ukraine at that point.
they're still not, right? Your entire argument for the invasion was that they basically, to an almost irrational sense, need these 6 choke points no matter what. They would even want those choke points.
I said that's not the only reason that they invaded. That's probably the primary reason.
Okay, but wouldn't that primary reason be exacerbated if they didn't have nuclear deterrence? Then they would really need those choke points, right?
Right, but at that point,
so I don't think that
no plausible method of getting to those choke points.
Well, they would have
even if they thought they had the military power they thought they had. They wouldn't have been able to stand up against NATO.
I feel that you're contradictory, right? Because you already said, right, that they were willing to take that chance because they assumed that they had the ability to get to those choke points without nuclear weapons, even if that meant, like, right. So, and then you said, well, everybody knows they're not going to use it.
They didn't think the U.S. was going to get involved. They thought we were going to play it like we did with Crimea and say,
it seems like
Russia,
you're having your
don't
cake.
do that, bad Russia.
I'll wait. It seems like you're having your cake and eating it too, right? Because what you're saying is like, well, they would never use nukes. They ain't going to do that. Even if they're getting their ass kicked, they're not going to use nukes. They won't. But on the other hand, the fact that they could use nukes is the only reason that they invaded in the first place.
Yeah, it's called credible deterrence.
But if you're saying there is no credible deterrence, because if you know they'll never use nukes, then surely the intel agencies know that.
We don't know 100%, right?
Okay. Well, then
100%.
that seems to contradict your argument.
I never said there was no 100% guarantee that they won't use nukes. I said they most likely will not.
Again, it just seems. It seems that these are big leaps of faith and contradictory positions, which it's not just you I've seen take this. I see this everywhere. I see John Kirby do this every day where he's like, Russia's... I debated these left-wing streamers. It was like a 5-on-1. It always is most of the time when I'm on panels, right? Yeah. And it was Destiny and Beckett and Dylan Burns, and it was on Counterpoint's channel, right? Oh, and I debated Dylan. To Dylan's credit, regardless of what you think of his politics, he actually went to Ukraine. He's back there again.
Right? Yeah.
So, So,
I hate his politics, but I respect him for doing what he did there.
Okay, so anyways, he basically is like, 8 months ago, I'm debating him on this topic, and he's like, it's already over, Russia's lost, they don't have a chance, it's all over but the crying, right? Okay, so then I'm talking to him 8 months later, and I'm like, is it still all over? Yeah, that's what you said, and Destiny agrees, yeah. And I was like, what do you think could happen if we pull out? And they're like, maybe they could get into Moldova, Russia. But they ain't getting there ain't no way they're getting into NATO countries. And then as soon as you debate them a little, they're like, well, we have to fight them over there so we don't fight them over here, is basically what they're saying. Like, that's the Biden administration narrative. But that's clearly bullshit, right? Because if they could only get into Moldova, fine, let's cut our office and leave them go into Moldova then, right? And they're contradictory because on one hand, they're saying, well, we have to have a blank check that's unauditable in perpetuity. If it's 2 years, fine. If it's 5 years, fine. If it's 10 years, fine. If it gets to the lengths of Afghanistan and it's 20 years, fine. And whatever the tab is, we have to pay it because the stakes are so high. But it's working out so well that Russia's a paper tiger and they're getting their ass kicked and they wouldn't even be able to get into anywhere except Moldova if we left tomorrow. Those are contradictory positions, right? And it's the same.
Well, I see a lot contradictory position, but that's not the whole of the position that I have. I think that without our support, Russia would have a decent chance of pursuing things beyond Ukraine.
I think that there are contradictions.
You have to remember, our support in Ukraine is dismantling the Russians' capability to project power any further.
Right. That's what we said about the Mujahideen. In fact, Zygmunt
Well, the
Brzezinski.
Mujahideen are not really projecting power.
But listen, no, it was the same argument. So, what I don't even know how to pronounce his name. It's like Zbignew. You know, Mika Brzezinski. She's married to Morning Joe Scarborough. You know who I'm talking about?
Name's familiar.
She's a journalist or pundit, I guess. Her father was involved in, I think, U.S. State Department back in the late 70s when we armed the Mujahideen. And he wrote this book called The Grand Chessboard. And I remember seeing this interview of him in like 99. I didn't see it in 99 because in 99, I was like 10th grade and I was, probably trying to find a girlfriend or some shit listening to punk music. So I wasn't really following this shit. But later,
99,
I see this
in
interview.
flight school.
So I see this interview and basically in like 98, 99, well, let's go back. Russia had been accusing the United States of arming the Mujahideen, who were then committing attacks in Russia-controlled areas. And the United States was like, no, we would never do that. And then we later admitted, of course we did. And so Brzezinski, who was there at the time, he gets
the Russians
asked.
did the same thing in Vietnam and in Korea. Chinese and Russians did the same thing in Korea.
Okay, nonetheless. So Russia was correct. Russia was correct in calling this out. And Brzezinski gets asked in like 98. He's like, but are you worried that these people you armed have become extremists and maybe they'll actually attack the United States in ways that Russia never did? And he said it was worth it, right? It harmed the Soviet Union. And then we got 9/11. Now, and then we got the Patriot Act, which set the precursor for all of the crazy stuff we're seeing, censorship on the internet, all of this corruption, right? Because of that event. We, what do they call it? Dialectics, right? Where it's like create the problem, then create the solution, which creates a new problem. Then you get to create the.
I don't think you can wait 9/11 with the Mujahideen so much as 9/11 with Desert Storm. The reason for that is Osama bin Laden did not want Americans in Saudi Arabia. You have to remember, Osama bin Laden was a Saudi, right? He didn't want Americans in Saudi Arabia. He wanted that to be an Arab problem taken care of by Arab states. So while he recruited from the pool of Mujahideen, 9/11 did not happen because of our arming the Mujahideen. 9/11 happened because of our presence in Saudi Arabia.
How was Osama bin Laden trained?
Well, we didn't train Osama himself.
But we trained people that did, right?
Well, yeah, sure. But
okay,
that's not that. Like I said, he pulled from that pool of people. But the cause of 9/11 was not the fact that we trained and armed the Afghani Mujahideen against the Soviet Union.
Well, okay, if we had never done that, if we'd never done that,
to us, our presence in Saudi Arabia.
If we never did that, what are the chances that Osama bin Laden rises to power and recruits a bunch of Saudis in order to commit a terrorist attack?
He could have pulled from another pool of.
But would he been in a position to pull?
Sure, absolutely.
You think?
Why wouldn't he have been? He's a rich and powerful. Wields power as a prince in Saudi Arabia.
I'd have to look to see if bin Laden was ever. I would have to look to see if bin Laden was ever specifically trained by the United States.
Yeah,
I believe that he was,
but he wasn't really. He didn't perform the acts. He was the financier behind it. Right?
Well, he
was the leadership.
It's funny. It's funny you should bring that up because earlier you mentioned that going into Afghanistan was for a good cause, just because of Osama bin Laden. And you're now saying he didn't perform the act, he was just the financier. But still, that was worth going into Afghanistan?
Well, he was the financier and the leadership behind it, but he didn't.
Well, who was the real?
He didn't. What was
he wasn't the real
name? Oh my God!
Who was the real financier?
Name that actually developed the strategy that they used for 9/11.
I don't know, but so you're saying that
the guy's name, but it's not it wasn't Osama.
But you're saying that the financier getting them would be worth going to war in a country for, correct?
Sure.
Who are the financiers other than bin Laden?
Of 9/11?
Yeah.
Al Qaeda. I mean.
How about Saudi princes?
Well, bin Laden was a Saudi prince.
Okay, why didn't we go to war in Saudi then?
Because he wasn't in Saudi.
But there were other financiers in Saudi that were in Saudi. We didn't go out. And you know what happened? The 9/11 Commission report, as soon as it started looking into it, let me finish.
Remember, the other piece is that Osama was the leadership behind Al Qaeda, not just the primary financier, right?
So now it's not worth it. Your statement that it was worth going to war to stop the financier, now you're retracting that. You're saying only if that financier is also a trainer.
You're putting words in my mouth. You missed where I said leadership as well as the financier.
So you're saying we should not go to war to stop the financier, only leadership and financier.
Leadership and leadership, yes.
I mean, it's hard to your stance seems to be crumbling. You have these very obscure reasons for why we should go to war. So if someone paid Osama bin Laden knowing that he was going to attack the United States and he happens to be a prince of Saudi Arabia, you would say that's not reason to attack him. But so then let's go a step further. Let's say that Osama has a general, right? And that general's from Pakistan. And he actually did the training more hands-on than Osama, and he financed 10% of the operation. Should we go to war in Pakistan?
I said the leadership. If that guy lives in Pakistan, should we go after him? Yes.
I mean, I don't know what to say. It seems pretty vague to me.
The war in Afghanistan was not really a war. At least it shouldn't have been a war against Afghanistan. It was a war against individuals. It was more of an actual, although we called Vietnam a police action. That's bullshit. But Afghanistan was actually more akin to a police action. We were there to get bin Laden and the Al Qaeda leadership.
I don't believe you. And I can prove it. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
We got bin Laden.
And we didn't pull out. You're right. No, you're not wrong.
So they might have told you that the reason was just to get bin Laden. But if that was the reason, then why didn't we leave when we got bin Laden?
And we
who, by the way, wasn't in Afghanistan. What's that?
We should have left when we got bin Laden.
But we didn't. And so if the people that told you the reason was to get bin Laden and then we got him and they said, we're going to stick around for another decade, that would seem to belie their claim that the reason was to get...
Al-Zawahiri. Al-Zawahiri was the guy's name.
Okay.
That actually architected 9/11.
And if the reason, as you've already said, was to get bin Laden, it's clearly not the case. Might have been part of the reason. Maybe the reason was a bunch of globalist reasons that are always these things, to have a war in perpetuity. By the way, this isn't so out of... It doesn't even, people that accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist, this self-evidentiary works as a way to enrich yourself, institute policies in your own country that are beneficial to you, scare the shit out of your people, take their rights away, send their poor people to go die in a foreign country, make tons of money for your military industrial friends, right? All sorts of opioid production and shit like that that's going on in Afghanistan.
Rob,
Yeah.
I want to pose a question to you from the chat. He didn't ask directly, but I wanted to get a clarification on what your stance is.
I got to step away for 2 minutes for a bio break real quick.
No problem, man.
Roger. So from my chat, Perfect Union says, Rob's whole point is we shouldn't show ultimate resolve, that we should capitulate due to risk. I want to know if that is your stance, and if not, what would you call an acceptable risk or an acceptable circumstance to justify nuclear war, risking nuclear war?
Well, it's a question. These things are always going to be different in unique situations, right? Let me give you an analogy. There was this, I like the Pittsburgh Steelers, or at least I used to, right? There was this player at training camp 4 years ago that got shit-faced on McKnight Road here in Pittsburgh, and they let him go because he's a shitty player. But when your star player does something like that, you don't let them go. Well, why? Well, because life is full of contradictions like that at times. So, for example, if a weak country does something that we don't like, it may be easier for us to use a militaristic presence to be able to do something. But when a nuclear-armed superpower is doing things we don't like, particularly when those things have been goaded on by us, and we've done very similar things to what they're doing, the idea of saying, well, that justifies nuclear war or an attempted nuclear war seems to be insane. This sort of gets back to a philosophical argument of deontology versus utilitarianism, right? This is where both systems get it wrong. There has to be some sort of combination of both systems. You've seen the trolley example. Would you put the trolley to kill one person to save 4 people? And a utilitarian might say yes, because that's less people dying, right? But the deontologist would say, no, you can't commit an act of evil. And if people, look, I'm no fucking scholar, right? If you want a good example of deontology versus utilitarianism, read the graphic novel The Watchmen. The bad guy, Ozymandias, right? He's a utilitarian. He says, I'm willing to kill millions of people because I think the Cold War is going to wipe us all out. So I'm willing to take an evil action of killing millions of people to ultimately save the world. And Rorschach's a deontologist. He says, even if you're right, I cannot accept this act of evil, ever. Right. Even if that means the world ending, I can't. So much so that he knows he's about to get killed, and he's like, I don't give a shit. I'm going to tell everyone you did this, right? Thereby sacrificing these millions for nothing. So the question is, to answer More Perfect Union's question, right? I'm not saying that you always just roll over, but there's all sorts of steps you could take depending on the who the offender country is, the level of the offense, the moral grounding that you have in order to criticize. Like, for example, if Russia tomorrow decides we're going to unleash chemical weapons all through fucking Ukraine and into Eastern Europe, yeah, that justifies probably literally declaring war on them. But if they're like, listen, we feel that this land is ours, it was former Soviet Union, a bunch of people in Crimea, would have voted for Russia. We feel that the United States and NATO is aggressing. We have no choice but to act now while we can before Ukraine's given weapons, made a company to NATO. And so we feel that we have to use force because diplomacy isn't working. And for the United States to then just say, well, no, this requires an act of force. We now have to have a no-fly zone and boots on the ground, which predictably will escalate to World War III. I think that's batshit crazy. Similarly,
well, Ukraine was not going to join NATO, right? They
Who
couldn't.
knows?
The NATO charter specifically disallows any country that has a territorial dispute from joining NATO.
So
even if
they signed a Minsk agreement as well, and they didn't divide by
because of Crimea.
They also signed the Budapest Accords, but
right.
I mean,
so what you're saying is that these treaties are oftentimes not followed to the letter of the law.
Grumple, I'm going to kill you.
Russia's not like, shit, this is ironclad.
Memorandum is not being followed.
Right. So the question would be, so again, we're looking at it from the perspective of Russia. And what you two would have me believe is this. Russia's like, well, NATO could never accept Ukraine because they wrote it there. So that'll never happen. That's your argument? That Russia's like, well, we'll take their word as gospel. As long as it's written, that's the end of it. Of course not. Of course, that's not how they're going to look at that situation.
But,
and it doesn't even remember if they become a
NATO.
It doesn't. And again,
it's even agree to go against their charter, because you have to remember, not only does it not have to have territorial disputes, it has to be a democracy with stability. It has to be approved by unanimous vote of all NATO members.
You're saying the paper says S. The Budapest Agreement, the paper said X. The Minsk Accords, the paper said X. Weren't followed. Right, so saying it couldn't happen because the paper said X, right? They're also said, right, that we weren't going to put boots on the ground. We also say that in the United States that only Congress could declare war. We don't follow that. Do you think Saddam was like, excuse me, you never declared war, right? You could take temporarily presidential executive action, but you didn't declare war. The paper says that, so you couldn't invade.
Authorization to use of military force was given by Congress.
There was no declaration of war. It's clearly against the spirit of what the founding fathers wanted, right? So that's not a persuasive argument. These papers, these treaties and things like that are flexible when people think that they could see a strategic advantage. Another example, you could look, for example, at, do you know what the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was? So the United States said that we need a nuclear moratorium, right? And so they pushed for something called the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, correct?
Yes.
And a bunch of countries signed it, right?
Right.
Did the United States?
Yes.
No, they didn't.
The Test Ban Treaty, I believe we did.
No, they signed START. They signed SWORD, but they never signed.
Missile Treaty.
No,
we never signed.
They never signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We demanded that a bunch of other countries sign it, but we didn't. Right? The START, the Strategic Arms Reduction
Treaty. But we
Treaty.
haven't done any nuclear tests.
That's not true.
Yeah, it is.
No, I'll guarantee it's not true. And you know what's funny? If a whistleblower leaked it, you would call
We
for
have
them to
only
be
done
prosecuted.
subcritical
Right.
testing. We have not
Right.
done any nuclear weapons testing.
You have no basis for making that claim. Then we might not have announced it publicly. In fact, with treaty, how did Israel get nuclear weapons?
Russia and other countries have the technical intelligence capacity to detect a nuclear device going off anywhere on the face of this planet, just as we do.
Okay.
If
And
we set off a nuke in a test,
they might say you did it, and we would say, no, we didn't. And
they'd be screaming.
So
we have not conducted any
did we sign
nuclear
treaties?
testing
Did
since
we sign
the early 90s.
I will guarantee that's not true. I'm 90% sure that's not true. And again, the irony is, if a whistleblower leaked documents to prove that, you'd say, well, that jeopardized lives, they should go to prison. That's the irony.
I would say
you would have probably been saying, if I debated you 2 weeks ago, there are no boots on the ground, no special forces on the ground in Ukraine. And then when a whistleblower leaks it, you're like, well, that guy should be prosecuted.
I always thought that there were not necessarily boots on the ground. I never have thought that there have been boots on the ground, American boots on the ground conducting combat operations.
Let me ask you this.
I do believe that we have CIA and covert ops assets conducting training and intelligence operations within Ukraine.
Did we sign treaties that said that we were not allowed to proliferate nuclear weapons to other countries?
Yeah, the non-proliferation treaty.
How did Israel get nuclear weapons?
From the South Africans?
No, that's not true. The United States.
The South Africans and the Israelis did a joint nuclear program. The Israelis kept theirs.
Everyone knows. Everyone knows.
Dismantled theirs.
It's absolute bullshit. Everyone knows that the United States provided Israel with nuclear weapons. Everyone knows it. It's one of the worst kept secrets in the world.
Even if that did happen, that was prior to the non-proliferation treaty.
I believe there were other treaties prior to that said that countries were not allowed to proliferate horizontally to other countries. Hey, look it up if you want.
I don't think there were.
Then why not admit it?
I might be wrong. I'll admit that I might be wrong, but I believe the NPT was the first of its kind.
We've also allegedly violated all sorts of things. In fact, we've actually been condemned in the UN for things like depleted uranium rounds in places like Afghanistan. So there's been a lot of violations of treaties that have been committed by the United States. I'm not saying that sometimes it may not be warranted or whatever.
Rounds? Say that again. I was
depleted uranium rounds.
What about
like in Afghanistan? Also violates treaties. Cluster bombs that have been used by the United States. I forget what's
the agreement on cluster bombs was never signed and ratified by the United States.
Maybe true, but it's still considered war crimes by the charters in the UN, correct?
I don't know.
So
I don't believe so.
The point I'm trying to make is the idea that Russia's just like, oh, let me ask you this: if the United States bombed Nord Stream, thereby creating an environmental disaster, is that an act of war?
I don't think the U.S. bombed Nord Stream.
If they did,
could be construed as one, but
they did. They did.
The portion that was bombed, I'd have to look it up. Was that actually owned by Russia, or was that German?
Yes. Who bombed Nord Stream? Who do you believe, if it wasn't the United States or NATO?
Oh boy.
I don't know.
Well, okay. Why are you so confident it's not the United States?
It could be a Ukrainian actor.
Okay. So Ukraine committed an environmental terrorist action.
Yeah, I believe that's very possible.
So do you think that means that, given that
it wasn't really an environmental terrorist action, since the pipeline had already been shut off, there was nothing in the pipeline?
I don't know that that's true. I would like to see proof of that.
Well, the pipeline was shut off. Even Russia said the pipeline was shut off because they shut down the flow of gas to Germany.
I will admit that it's difficult to know what is the truth coming out of these situations, but I've seen massive amounts of reporting of the environmental destruction that came as a result of this. I have people in chat saying that's just not true, that there absolutely was gas. I don't know one way or the other. But assuming that there was some sort of environmental damage,
doesn't really produce a pollutant in the water. It's gas. It's going to come out of the water. It's literally gas.
Why would someone blow up a pipeline that nothing was flowing from?
To prevent it from being turned back on, to take that
When
incentive away from Germany.
When was it shut off?
Early on. I don't know what the date was. I can look it up though.
Why would Russia shut off their own pipeline?
I'm not trying to
They
participate
shut it
in the
off
conversation, but a reason
because-
is to send a message. I'm going to mute up again.
Yeah, they shut it down to keep Germany to cut the flow to Germany, to Europe.
So Russia shut down their pipeline, was no longer exporting to Germany, right? And so then either Russia or Ukraine blew up the Russian pipeline.
Well,
So we
I
can
didn't say
admit if Russia
did
had
it.
the ability and already
I
shut
think
it off.
Ukraine did it.
Okay,
Because
but let's just say it couldn't have been Russia.
That removes that incentive of Russia saying, Germany, if you don't send Leopard tanks to, or authorize Leopard tanks being sent to Ukraine, we'll turn the gas back on for you.
Okay, so
That's not
you would
longer
admit
even a possibility. That can't happen.
you would admit that there is zero incentive for Russia to bomb their own pipeline. So when the United States
Yeah,
came out
I
and said
never
we
s-
can,
I
so
never
you
said
admit
it
that
was
the United
Russia.
States knew that that was a lie when they were saying that.
I don't know. I would hope that people in charge are as smarter than me and knew that was not correct. So
Okay, all right. So more examples of propaganda.
I absolutely agree that our government
Okay.
lies to us, Rob. You're not going to
Okay.
have to convince me of that.
I don't think that I would be cheering for a government that I'm admitting lying to us to be getting us into a potential World War III type situation based on the idea that there was a moral imperative or strategic imperative. Like you're just believing Peter Zayan? That's it?
Well, no, there is a strategic imperative to that.
How do you know if they're lying?
If we don't stop and if we don't stand up against a bully trying to take that which is not his, we invite future issues with that amongst other up and coming powers.
Why did it? Okay.
Do we
you
want to have
think
to stand up against one bully, or do we want to have to stand up against 10?
Why
I'd
didn't they
stand up
stop?
against one?
You remember when the Saudis bullied Yemen by bombing them? If the United States didn't stand up, that encouraged bullies all over the place, correct?
We should have stood up. I'm not saying.
Well, instead we
Rob,
financed.
You're saying
We
that
sold
these
weapons.
things that we didn't stand up, we didn't do this. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have done something, right?
What you're arguing
Not at
is,
all.
what you're arguing is, if we allow an act of bullying to occur, then more bullying will occur. So in this situation, even if it increases the chances of nuclear war to 30%, a line in the sand must be drawn. Then I could give you 100 other examples of, quote, bullying from countries that the United States either didn't intervene or actively participated in or financed, and you'll be like, well, that's okay. They didn't,
No,
they
I
should have
didn't
acted,
say
but
it
they
was
didn't.
okay. We should have stood
Okay,
up
but they
against
didn't,
it.
so
That's
then-
what
Bullying
you're not
great again.
understanding, Rob. I'm not at all saying that it was right that we didn't stand up against it.
What we call this in
But
debate
just
is
because
what
we
we
didn't
call this.
do that does not mean that we should not do that now and in the future.
What's up? Are you shushing me or what's the deal? You have go ahead if
Do
you have
what?
something to say.
No, Grumple. It's it's the ongoing issue that me and Grumple are having. It's not.
Oh, okay. I didn't. I thought you had
Oh, no, he,
I
he
do.
muted me.
Although I do
I
want
was
to.
giving you a prompt.
I do want
Zach
to use
didn't
that
understand the
though.
prompt.
I do want to use that though as a quick so.
Zach, stop muting me. I can mute myself.
Grumple, I swear to God, I'm gonna kill you. Question from the chat, Rob.
There. Let's get it done.
Rob, are you gonna? And this is from one of my mods, so I'm gonna try to rephrase this.
Well, I don't care.
Okay, then I'll just give it to you, Rob. Rob, are you gonna bring up an actual argument against war with Ukraine that doesn't boil down to you believe a minute chance of nuclear war is possible?
Yes, I gave an entire argument. I've been generous in talking to my opponent here and going through if his rationale is true, that the reason for this is because of X. I've been given reasons why that's still a bad rationale to go. I gave my rationale, which was unrebutted, which was that I believe this is corrupt money laundering a corrupt money laundering situation that is designed to intentionally provoke authoritarian actions at home and abroad, that will benefit the wealthiest of our country and the wealthiest of countries like Ukraine, and be detrimental and cause the lives of people like the people on the ground in Ukraine, and will also harm the poor and working class people of this country by not only devaluing the dollar, not only making the dollar less likely to be the world reserve currency, but also making it more likely that there's actually conflicts that exacerbate from this type of situation. And I've pointed that out by showing how corrupt these very people telling us we need to make these sacrifices are. I'm sorry, is your mod going to actually make an argument as to why I'm incorrect, or is he just going to be passive aggressive in his stupidity that he asks me questions in? Perhaps he'd like to jump on and get his ass handed to him as well, huh?
Well, sometimes Maru is a bit of a smartass. So I'm actually on your side with that one, Rob. And that
I'm just
leads
fucking with him. It's all right.
that's a good place to I want to circle back to. It never really got addressed, and I'm gonna start really pushing to the conversation in this direction, because it's at the end of the day, this is the most important thing in my mind about this whole thing. What happens if we keep pushing Russia? And because look, Russia is in talks with China right now. They already have a business relationship. China hates the U.S. China hates everything the West has been doing. China is looking for an excuse to go all in on a counter-offensive to try to knock the West off its world power pedestal. I have not heard anything from you, Twisted, about the possible consequences about continuing to participate in this war, and the consequence and the dire situation that would be China and all of its buddies going all in on helping Russia and the resulting World War III. And Rob, I want to hear your thoughts on that too.
I don't believe that China would go all in on helping Russia. China and Russia are not friends.
They weren't friends. They are quickly becoming
Still
friends.
not friends.
They
China
weren't
is
before. They are quickly becoming that way.
China is talking to Russia as a friendship of convenience. They want Siberia. They want the oil and gas fields that exist.
China
in
wants Siberia.
China even has a name for Siberia, the Northern Resource Area of China. They literally, that is what it's called.
All right, let me ask you this. Okay, given that, do you think that China benefits from the United States position in Ukraine? We're sending a bunch of money. The Biden administration is saying that money we're sending and the Russia's invasion is responsible for declined economic ventures in the United States. For example, the price of gas is so high because of Putin's invasion. That's what he says. Thereby, a lot of the natural resources in Russia now receiving other markets. Also creating a movement of the BRICS nations, including places like Brazil, including maybe increasingly France and Macron, questioning whether or not the dollar is reserve currency. Does all of that seem to be beneficial to China?
Yeah, I mean it is. China is playing the game of do what's best for China, just like every country does. And right now, being on friendly terms with Russia is the best move for China.
Do you think that
I think they're going to start supplying Russia with weapons or actually putting troops in Ukraine to help China or to help Russia? Absolutely not.
Do you think that China is a bigger long-term threat to the United States than Russia?
Depends on what happens in the next 5 to 10 years with their economy and their demographics. They could either go one way or the other.
Well, that's the Zayan answer, but Zayan would say that Russia's just in the same
economy is not growing the way it was. Their economy is kind of a pyramid scheme. They're building hotel or condos and then tearing them down just to keep people employed. We're seeing runs on banks. We're starting to see people protesting. But at the same time,
you'll see
they are a dictatorship, right? And toppling a dictatorship is not something that happens very often.
Okay,
Or
I
at least
understand,
not
Peter.
organically, not without outside help.
I understand Peter
So,
Zan says that China, because of
Yes, I
demographic.
think that China has the potential to be a bigger threat than Russia.
Okay, cool. Then you would admit that the actions we're taking are helping a country that is a bigger threat to the United States.
In the future, yes. Russia's
Okay.
currently a bigger threat.
How so?
Well, they were. We thought they were.
They're not.
Let me put
Clearly.
it that way. We
Right.
thought they were. We thought they
Okay.
had a much more capable military than they obviously do.
Now we know. So China's the bigger threat. China is certainly economically a bigger threat, culturally a bigger threat. I mean, it seems most likely militaristically, just for sheer manpower, a bigger threat. And even if we thought that
Their
militaristically
manpower is
Russia,
not a bigger threat because they can't. There's a huge difference between having a large military and a large military that can project power. They don't have the capability to project power with their military.
neither's Russia.
They can project power. They can project power regionally,
but
but
neither's
they
Russia.
can't project power. We know that now.
Okay, well, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking some sort of hypothetical. I'm saying who's a bigger rival, a bigger threat to the United States, China or Russia? I think the answer is quite simply
on equal terms, but probably China slightly more than Russia
Well, I
because of
disagree.
future potentiality.
I disagree. I think that China is a bigger threat by far. And I think
potential.
that you should agree with that as well, given that you've basically admitted that Russia is a paper tiger. We know economically there's no chance that Russia can remotely compete with us. Same is true culturally. Like no one's changing movie posters in Hollywood because the premiere in Russia, like they are with things like Black Panther in
That's for
China.
sure.
Like the culture, and not only that, the things. Although it's true that we're reliant on things from Russia, our economy is so reliant on cheap products from China. So it's clearly in
But
every metric, China's a bigger
On the
threat.
flip side, China's economy is so reliant on us buying their cheap
True,
products.
absolutely true. But China as an enemy could do more harm to the United States in a varying amount of ways than Russia can. Unless you consider nuclear exchange, but then China can do that.
If you're talking from an economic perspective, yes. From a military perspective, I would say they're about equal.
Nonetheless, then overall, China's a bigger threat, and we're taking actions that are benefiting China.
I don't think we're taking actions that are benefiting China. China is being opportunistic, which we would be opportunistic too. Anybody, any
Right.
country would.
But
Sure.
they wouldn't be able to be opportunistic if for not the actions that the United States is taking. For
Yeah, but
example,
come back-
the sanctioning of Russia, which you might say is a good thing. The signal that has sent to China is, okay, if the United States gets upset with us, they could snap their fingers and say, well, we're not going to trade with you. And then all of a sudden, like, and I know you followed Peter Zan, one of the things they're saying is that, no one will insure these Russian chips anymore. Like you've heard him talk about this, right? That's all sort of the idea of the dollar is the world reserve. If the United States says we're going to sanction you, then all of a sudden, because the world reserve currency is the dollar, that makes it very difficult for those countries, particularly those that engage in large amounts of trade like China, to be able to continue to do that. And so China is now being opportunistic, warning the rest of the world. And you see people like Lula in Brazil talking about this. Macron's talking about this. It's like, look, maybe it's time to say the United States isn't the hegemon. Maybe it's time to say this good deal the United States has had with their dollar being the world reserve currency is something that needs to change. All of that is a result of the actions of the United States, even if you think morally justified with this conflict. Now, that's to not even get into whether or not that there could be the idea of being stretched thin. And so then like a military intervention in a place like Taiwan or North Korea deciding to be aggressive to places like Japan and things like that, which is what Zach was asking, right? Those things could happen, but we don't even have to get to that. Right? If we recognize that China is a significant threat or a bigger threat than Russia, and it's all about benefiting the people of the United States, well, are the actions that are benefiting China, is it worth it? I don't know. Like it seems to be another.
I don't know either.
And here's another thing, right? To go
know.
back, like you believe that it was most likely, you believe it wasn't Russia, so it was either a NATO ally or Ukraine. So the United States, a NATO country, or Ukraine that bombed the pipeline, right? You would say it's one of those three groups.
I would say it was most likely Ukraine.
Okay. So let's say it was Ukraine. I don't understand how Ukraine would get the technological capabilities to be able to pull off something like that. But let's say that's true. Let's say it was Ukraine or any one of
Ukraine's
the.
not a technological backwards country.
Yeah, they pretty much are, except for what we've
really
given
not.
them. They're worse than Russia. You just said Russia can't even put tires on trucks. Ukraine's worse than that without the U.S. intervention. No doubt.
Ukraine maintained their what little equipment they had.
They did not. They didn't. They weren't using it in the same way that Russia was.
They
Nonetheless,
didn't
let's say it
prior
was
to
one of
2014.
let's say it was
You're
one
right.
of those three groups. It was the United States, a NATO ally, or Ukraine. For the sake of argument, we'll say it was Ukraine. Why did they?
I want to continue down that path. They did not maintain their equipment prior to 2014 with the Crimea annexation. Post that, when we started sending our advisors over there to train them, their maintenance and technical capabilities developed rapidly and massively beyond what they were prior to that.
I do not believe you
So
that
they
the
are
Ukrainian
not a technically
military.
backward
I do not
country.
believe you. I do not believe you that the Ukrainian military was more sophisticated than the Russian military. I do not believe you. In fact, Peter Zan doesn't agree with you, right? Because what he's talking about is now what's different is the capabilities, because they've had a year to train with the more sophisticated U.S. weaponry and they've been being trained by U.S. personnel.
Well, sure,
that
but a
now that they'll be
capability to do a dive down to blow up a pipeline is pretty simple potatoes compared to maintaining a massive level of military equipment.
I've heard the way in this was done was a very sophisticated clandestine operation, but nonetheless, it's irrelevant to the greater point. Fine, magically.
A sophisticated clandestine operation is
I'll
just
concede
training.
everything.
That doesn't matter equipment or maintenance.
I concede everything you say. Ukraine secretly has the best military in the history of the world. Their Navy SEALs are superior to Russia's in every way. Cool. It doesn't matter. It's not really germane to the argument. So for the sake of argument, we'll say Ukraine had the capability. They did this. Great. Why did they do it?
To prevent Russia from being able to turn the gas back on to Germany.
So what Ukraine did was intentionally harm Germany.
No, I would say not.
That's just what you
Since
said.
the gas was already off.
But you said that it could have
flowing to if the gas was flowing to Germany, I would say yes.
No, that's an outrage because that's an outrageous statement to say. Because here's why, right? Because the argument would be why they needed to blow it up. Which I also had seen no evidence whatsoever that Russia was not sending gas to Germany. Maybe it was shut off for a month or a week or so. I have not seen any evidence. You have watched the St. Peter Zeman stuff that the majority of your argument's coming from. The Peter Zeman material talks about how Germany, the only way that they survived this winter was it was unseasonably warm. Had it not been unseasonably warm because that pipeline was blown, let me finish, because that pipeline was blown up, that they would have suffered inexorably. They also says that he looks for that to start to come, and we can see that prices already went up with them having to import now from like 14 other places, and that Germany as a country is basically going to cease to exist as a manufacturing powerhouse because they are losing these resources, particularly natural gas, but other things from Russia. That is what the primary source you have for your position said, correct? I've watched the same material as you, so I know what you said.
I'm trying to remember if that's what was said. I don't want to speak
But
without
but you, the threats,
definitive, but
yeah, right. Not the exact numbers or anything, but you admit that he said they're in a lot of trouble. Remember, he says, "Go buy a BMW now." Remember, he says that because he's like Germany's.
I remember him saying that.
Right,
yeah,
right. That's what he's saying.
But I thought that was more on his demographics thing, combined with this.
Well, that's combined with demographics, but he says that he talks specifically about how the unseasonably warm winter was the only way. Like the idea, right? And it doesn't even make sense, right? It's like you saying, well, they forced Germany's hand because there was fear that they would turn this gas back. I don't even necessarily, I'm not saying you're wrong. You may absolutely be right. You're the first person I've heard say Germany was not receiving any gas from Russia. Let me ask you some questions about it. How long were they not receiving gas from Russia?
I don't know. I don't want to say a number because I don't know off the top of my head.
In history, were there times that pipeline got shut off because it was not profitable at certain parts of the year or something like that? Or was it something that was continuously running until at some point Russia shut it off here this one unique time?
It's only been shut down for maintenance prior to that.
And this time it was shut down pre or post invasion of Ukraine?
Post invasion.
How many months into the invasion of Ukraine did Russia decide to shut down the pipeline?
September 2nd. Russia's Gazprom say they'd have done it. Right, yeah. Yeah, September 2nd.
They shut it. And when was it blown up?
While he's well twisted is looking for that, Rob, I have a question from chat again.
Okay.
One of my people feels as if you have not addressed this. What?
26.
So, hang on, Twisted. Just hang on. Yeah. What? So your position is we shouldn't be there, and I correct me if I'm wrong. Your position is we should pull out and stop giving assistance.
Right.
What happens if we did that right now? What happens? And especially what happens if that prompts Russia to step up its present and escalate? Don't you think that perhaps, and again, this is from I don't think this is from chat. Don't you think that because we're there now, it's kind of a, well, now we're in it and we need to stick it out kind of thing?
So let me answer the question and then talk about the inverse of that, right? So to answer the question specifically, how would they escalate? Who am I to believe that they would escalate? Because everyone in positions of power or authority on this in the United States or people for advocate this tell me they can't. Tell me they're a paper tiger. That at best they'll get into Moldova. So the idea that it's again these contradictory opinions. So I'm supposed to believe simultaneously that we have to fight them over there, so we don't fight them over here. If we don't fight them over there, then it'll escalate and harm the United States and harm Eastern European NATO allies, etc. But at the same time, Ukraine's kicking their ass in ways no one expected, and Russia's a paper tiger. These are contradictory opinions. But let's say hypothetically that was the case, that somehow they were able to escalate. All of a sudden they'll be able to go to Poland. Well, then we don't prosecute thought crimes. If they do decide to attack a Eastern European country that's a NATO ally, then I guess at that point, unlike now, we would be justified in doing something about it. That would be a complete declaration of war, which would be vastly different than what we see going on specifically with declaring war on Ukraine, which we're not honor bound by some sort of treaty or some sort of alliance to be able to defend. The problem is, even if it was that someone should be acting, as I've said previously, why would I trust a bunch of people that everyone in this debate are agreeing are corrupt liars that have lied to us repeatedly in situations that led to the destabilization of countries, the very countries that we were told we had to sacrifice to save, like Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Now all of a sudden they're right this time. This time they're correct. Never mind the man behind the curtain that lied to you the last 3 times that some shit like this happened. This time they're right. So, hey, they'll just keep being bullies if we don't do it. What would you do? Now, the inverse to the question would be this. Okay, if the argument is, well, we're already there, even if you disagreed with it initially, why not stay? How long? If we're admitting that they're corrupt, and this is the question I asked, what's the incentive for them to end this conflict? Just like Afghanistan, what was the incentive to end it? They drug it on for 20 years. Meanwhile, who suffered? The people of Afghanistan. The United States soldiers that were sent over there. Yeah. Who profited? Well, leadership, the generals that got promotions, the military industrial complex, the reaping of their resources in places like Afghanistan that went to benefit wealthy people in the United States and around Europe. Right. Same question here. So I would ask the questioner, how long are you willing to stay? I debated a left-wing person named Bastiat almost 8-9 months ago. I asked that was his stance. His stance was, listen, at this point, we've given enough. We had to give, we had to do this, but at this point, it's clear that Russia's not going to be able to win. And I said, how much more would you give? He said, this is enough. I said, so just to be clear, if we hear that we're giving another $40 billion to Ukraine, you would oppose that? He said, yes. Do you think he opposed it? I don't know. I haven't talked to him since. I bet he didn't. And I bet everyone that's saying we have to be there, would in perpetuity, the same people they're admitting lie to us. And this is why it's really funny coming from right-wingers. They'll tell you that the media lies to you, the FBI lies to you, the CIA lies to you, anytime they're going after a Republican, anytime they're going after Trump, anytime they're going after DeSantis. But on this one issue, we have to believe them wholeheartedly. And we have to continue. If they keep telling us, keep sending that, but we can't audit it. Sorry, we can't audit it, Rand Paul. We can't do that. And Seymour Hersh and people are reporting that people like Zelensky are, embezzling $400 million out of it. Sorry, there's nothing we could do with that. And probably in the future, we'll say, sorry, we lost a bunch of weapons and now terrorists got them. But we still have to just unquestionably accept because they're bullies or because we have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over there. So that's my question. When do we say enough's enough? Do we constantly and whose claim do we trust? I mean, to Twisted's credit here, and I think everyone's credit in this debate, we admit there's propaganda on all sides of the ledger. So who are you going to trust? Who are you going to trust that say this is the exact dollar amount and the exact amount of time we need to stay here? This is it. Because I'm telling you right now, like when we get to closing statement, I could just say this now. Like I don't have to bury the lead here. The people of the Ukraine are fucked. They're screwed. They're going to end up the same way the people of Afghanistan, the same way the people of Libya, the same way the people of Iraq. It's coming. It's not going to be different this time. As soon as it becomes non-beneficial for the United States to be there, they ain't going to be concerned about stopping a bully anymore. Just like they're not concerned about Saudi doing it to Yemen. They don't give a shit. They're not altruistic. And as soon as it's more of a hindrance to them, if the American people, if 90% of them would come out and say, this is my primary issue I'm voting on, and I'm against sending this funding to Ukraine, Biden would, like that, switch his position in a heartbeat. And then the people of Ukraine are the ones that'll be screwed at the end of the day. They're going to be left holding the bag. That's the irony of all of this. All of these big government people that have these great proclamations about all these policies. You can see it domestically in the United States. All of these utopian policies in the inner city. We got to save inner city black people. Defund the police. Send these people. Open air, give crack pipes to people. Who suffers? I'm not suffering in rural Pennsylvania. That shit doesn't affect me. It affects the very communities that they fucking call me racist for saying it's going to harm these communities.
Well,
I was called racist.
One of the things that's very hard on U.S. foreign policy, U.S. policy in general. Every 4 to 8 years, our policy can swing from one extreme to the other. And it makes any kind of long-term geopolitical strategy very difficult. It makes it very difficult for other countries to deal with the United States because we are so. I mean, in the end, we waffle on these things. We there's no unified position.
Well, given that, doesn't that mean that facilitating a war through a third-party country like Ukraine is a very dangerous thing? Because let's say that Trump wins.
Thank you for the bits, Wolf.
Let's say Trump wins in 2024 and says
war is a very dangerous thing.
Well, no, this is different. This is different.
Power.
This is different, though, right?
Okay.
Because
let me. I want. Sorry to interrupt you, but I want to. I want to start doing my job a little bit. First of all, follow up to the previous question. Same. It's Maru again, being a smartass. He's follow up. No, I asked. So here's the point that he really wants to drive home and get an answer to. How is your position, Rob, not going to make things with Russia, China, Brazil, and the Saudis worse?
Because facilitating a peaceful resolution is beneficial than escalating towards World War III.
Okay.
Your wife cheats on you, Mr. Assume Moderator. Could you sit down and talk to her and try to have a resolution that is amicable, or should you punch her in the face? But if you don't punch her in the face, then she'll cheat again. And wouldn't that make it worse?
I agree with you, just so that's clear. I've been on your side most of this time. I'm just trying to be fair.
Your ass is what you should do.
Agreed. That would be the most the
happily divorced
the proper
man over here.
I'm still happily married. I'm lucky.
I'm happily divorced.
I'm happily married. I hope it stays that way.
We'll see. You better take the right side of this debate, or it could put cracks in that marriage. But no, I mean, the question is, it's not. It's the caller is assuming, right, the same thing, or the questioner is assuming the same thing Twisted did. This idea of the idea of the bully thing, right? And so the idea, like, we can already see how Saudi is basically like, things are going so swimmingly right now with the policies, right? Like Biden's begging them to produce more oil and they're like, no, and we don't think that we're going to exclusively trade in dollars anymore. So the argument is what? As shitty as that is, right? Well, it would be even shittier if we would have, instead of facilitating a war, tried to have a peaceful resolution. I don't understand the question. They're begging the question, but the question itself is rooted in fallacies. There is no evidence that if the United States wouldn't have pursued military intervention in Ukraine and instead would have been like, listen, we have your back, Ukraine, at the negotiating table, and we're going to see what we can do. And there might be some losses for Ukraine in that. Maybe they give up some territory for things in return from Russia. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but we didn't even try a peaceful resolution. In fact, now there's reporting when Ukraine has said, okay, we're opening now potentially to having a peaceful resolution, that the United States is like, no, too late now. And so we'll see how much Ukrainian sovereignty matters if, let's say, another 300,000 of them die and they say, okay, we're ready to try to negotiate. Where will these people be if the United States says, no, sorry, you don't get to negotiate. We won't allow it. Will they be talking about bullying and things like that then? It's an interesting question. You know, I will admit, I do tend to agree, although it's hard to know, that I would guess that the majority of people in Ukraine right now probably don't want to end the fighting. They don't want to make concessions to Russia. But this doesn't end, right? This doesn't end without both sides giving a little. It's just not going to, right? It's not as if you're going to bloody, you know, think of the rationale that they're making. That Putin's this unhinged maniac that for his legacy and to control these choke points is willing to even provoke a war with NATO and going in and doing this. In what scenario does he leave with his tail between his legs? If he's really this strongman, crazy leader that we're told, and it's literally going to be, you are going to be a historic laughingstock in the country of Russia. You're going to be shamed not only in the future, but also now by your people. You're going to live in disgrace if you're not assassinated. You don't think that dude's not willing to push the button?
Well, it ends, in my opinion, when he's ousted from power from within his own country. That's when it ends.
Zahan again disagrees with you. He says the chances of that happening are extremely unlikely.
I'm not Zahan. That's
I know.
my opinion. It ends when he is ousted from power.
Well, I don't think that the things the United States are doing make that more likely, because the United States would need to also be winning some propaganda victories in Russia. And given what we know now, that like no doubt that U.S. ally or U.S. themselves blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, and that they're cheering on basically assassinations of bloggers that are occurring within the boundaries of Russia. I don't think that that's going to, those sorts of actions, whether they be being committed by the United States or by Ukraine, are not going to encourage popular support. It's going to galvanize the people of Russia because they're not going to like the idea of targeted assassinations in their country. So if that's the plan, I think we're also going about
Welcome in, Stella. Good to see you.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily going to be the people of Russia ousting him. I think it's going to be one of his oligarchs. That's going to...
Even still, that's actually a better argument.
Worse. That could be worse.
Right. We don't know what
oligarch could wind up being worse than Putin. We don't know.
Right. I just don't think.
I think that's the road we're headed down in Russia. Is that one of his oligarchs going to say, you know what, this is enough. We're losing money. You know, those oligarchs are all about money. We're losing all this money. We're under sanctions. Our economy's going to shit. You know what? Time for Putin to go.
But they would have to have.
I want to hop in there and again do my job. So here's going back to one of the original purposes of this debate, the motive for the conflict. And we've heard a lot of argument about some of the surrounding circumstances of the conflict, but this is an angle that hasn't been addressed yet, and it's a question my wife wanted to pose to the debate because it's poignant. So we have a bunch of argument for the extraneous motivations, the money laundering, the political factors. There's a bunch of argument in favor of that. What me and her want is, can either of you give me any evidence, and this is more aimed at Twisted because he's the one that thinks it's more military he thinks it's military geostrategy. Can you give me any evidence that it isn't the money laundering, that it isn't the political motivations? Is there any evidence to suggest that it isn't purely that? Because the military geostrategy argument, it makes sense on paper, but there's absolutely zero evidence that that is the primary motivation, outside of people arguing that it is.
No, I cannot give you evidence that it's not, doesn't have anything to do with the other extraneous stuff. I even conceded that with you when we were talking about this the other night, that is a possible part of the
Don't
motive.
do that. I can make your argument for you. Right? The argument that you should be making is this. Well, evidence to support that conclusion would be that this has happened like roughly every 60 to 80 years in Russia's history. That they've constantly been engaging in conflict surrounding these areas.
And again, and I mean, they did it in 2014 with Crimea.
Yeah,
and if you look at the areas they've been active in, those areas are where those choke points are. I wish I had my map that I could pull up, but Georgia, Kazakhstan, Crimea, and now Ukraine. Those are all where those choke points are. That's my evidence that they want those choke points. Their activity has been targeted there. They're not going after other former Soviet territories. They're going after where these choke points are right now. Doesn't mean that they won't go after other former Soviet bloc countries in the future.
So,
but I was going to say, I can now argue against that position as well. Here's what I would say.
Well,
yeah, go ahead if you want.
Okay, so to add more nuance to that question then, would you say that maybe, because where a lot of this comes from is what they call the broken window fallacy, basically the illusion that, you know, if you're spending money or whatever, or resources to repair supposed damage, it's going to create economic welfare for everybody involved. So is this and we've seen them do this many times with things like Vietnam and Afghanistan and all of the other stuff, create damage and then go and repair it and whatever. So is this an opportunistic situation? Maybe? Where...
Yeah, I mean, my belief is, like, for example, there are many ways to look at it. The truth is, and I think Twisted would agree with this, although there's no doubt a primary motivator, I think it's a corrupt motivator, that it's malevolent by the United States. I'm sorry, that I think the motivation of Russia is probably primarily one of getting pissed off by being goaded by NATO and the United States. He disagrees. He thinks that it's these choke point things. But I think we would all agree that there could be a plethora of reasons, right? The question of, like, why is the United States getting involved? Or why is Russia getting involved? It's two separate questions, but yeah, certainly I think that I agree with you that the money laundering, the broken windows fallacy, the idea that like all of these institutions in the United States and lobbyists, et cetera, like that, when we see countries that are devastated like Iraq, you see Halliburton go in and reap their natural resources. You see the same sort of things that's occurring in places like Afghanistan. So yeah, I think that that's certainly part of it. There's more specific things that I know less about. For example, there are questions about oil pipelines that wanted to be ran through certain places, and so the idea of having a stronghold for the United States in Ukraine would allow sort of a pipeline that would circumvent the Nord Stream pipeline, which would mean that the United States would be more in control of sort of that trade of important natural resources and things like that. Then there's the idea of just strict embezzlement in the ways that we've talked about. Then there's the idea of possibly wanting to protect people that have dirt on them in the form of stuff that was going on during the Obama administration.
Well, I want to take this in a little bit different direction. Yes, there is a economic motive for the U.S. to participate in this. However, I don't believe that it has anything to do with this money laundering and all that. I think the economic incentive is with our armament industry, right? Mm-hmm. If we are giving Ukraine our old equipment, which is forcing us to buy newer, better tech, which I'm in favor of. We should have the best freaking thing that money can buy everywhere. But it's forcing us to do that quicker and earlier than we might have otherwise. So our defense industry is making money hand over fist off of this. And you know what? I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I'm not. So it's ironic, right? This is ironic because your entire stance of why you think we should be there is to stop bullying, because we have to stop this incentive for bullies to go out and do shit, right? Well, you just gave the incentive for huge lobbyists in the United States and the military-industrial complex to constantly encourage more war. And you're like, I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with us having the biggest, baddest military on the planet.
Okay,
Absolutely.
let me hop in there and say this.
100%.
Let me hop in there and say this, Twisted. We don't need to have a war to continuously upgrade our military. First of all, the Republican Party could lobby for a bill that says, hey, we're going to, on a rolling basis, upgrade our tech. We're not going to allow tech older than 10 years to be on our active register of tech that could be deployed. That's thing one. Thing two, we could sell our old
Sure,
tech.
we could, but we don't.
Well, but my point is the cost of human lives and proxy wars to justify getting rid of old tech so we can buy new shit is demonstrably evil. So, second thing, we could sell our old tech. We could demilitarize what could be demilitarized and sell it to civilians. We could just plain scrap it. There's 1,000 things that would be a better route to go and more moral and ethical than proxy war, so we can get rid of our shit.
I don't think that's a primary motivator. It's just a bonus that we're making money off of it.
Well, there is a disagreement between you and Rob for sure on that one. And that is one of the fundamental schisms between the two sides of this debate, is what the primary motivations for the war are.
Right.
To get back on
that's
this.
Why
Okay.
we're kind of going in circles here, because
Well, no, I think that this area that you just said is another like philosophical disagreement that I think is kind of shocking, right? So if we had to approach sort of our ideas of this, you would seem to be coming from this from more of a utilitarian framework, where you say, listen, sometimes you have to shake your stick to tell the bully you can't do this anymore or bad things will happen in the future, right? Okay, I disagree with that position, but that's sort of a philosophical difference that we're having here. But when it comes to an institution that's far more likely to actually be in a position to facilitate wars, i.e. the military-industrial complex that's lobbying to the United States military, who we've seen in the past facilitate these wars unjustly, like Syria, Libya, etc., Vietnam, what they lied about the Gulf of Tonkin, you have no problem with that, with sending the signal to them. Yeah, it's cool. We're glad you're making money hand over fist. Like, given that, think how this will play out then.
No, wait. Develop new technologies.
Just wait, though.
Increase our military capacity.
Let me finish, right? So let's say you're an executive for Raytheon, and you're like, oh boy, we're making tons of money with this conflict in Ukraine. You know what we're going to do? We're going to back a candidate that we think should find an excuse to start a war in Pakistan. Oh, hundreds of thousands of Pakistanis are dying? Oh, maybe U.S. troops go over and die too. Whatever. Hey, we're making money again. Oh, that worked that time too. Here's what we'll do. Let's find an excuse to have another war in Iraq again. Let's go back there. Like, you don't see how this provides. If your argument is at some point you have to stop the incentive for the bully to create war, wasn't this just another form of bullying? It's driven out of greed. But how about then I'm against this because I want to stop the incentive of Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and all of them to facilitate wars in the future. How about that?
Well, I would have to, first of all, believe that Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, et cetera, are facilitating wars. I don't believe they are. So
you don't think that? So you know? Okay. Do you think that they are facilitating? Do you think they are successfully lobbying people in our position in our politics?
Well, I think everybody's lobbying. I mean, I think lobbying needs to go the fuck away.
But the question is, do you think they're successful in their lobbying efforts? In other words, that the large amounts of money that we know on record that they're giving result in politicians that are enacting policies that are favorable to them.
I think it depends on the politician that's given the money, but yes.
Okay, so we'll say yes. Okay, so given that, do you think that companies like Raytheon are lobbying for policies that will benefit them financially?
Well, sure, but here's the thing. We have not done what we're doing in Ukraine to this degree in the past. We have not given World War II aside, that's different animal, right? Because we got physically a different animal with World War II. But we haven't, when we gave the Mujahideen, you would keep wanting to bring that up, weapons, we gave them Stingers. We gave them AR-15s or M16s, right? I don't know why I said AR-15. They gave them M16s, right? We didn't give them tanks at the time, the M60 or the early model, the M1. We didn't give them this equipment.
I mean,
So this hasn't happened in the past.
again, it doesn't
The
matter if
reason-
it's
the reason we're making money off of this is a side effect of the fact that we're giving Ukraine our old equipment, because that accelerates the rate at which we have to replace that old equipment. That
I understand.
old equipment was already slated to be replaced, right? Like we gave them the AGM-88A HARM, which is an anti-radiation missile, anti-radar missile.
I don't believe you. I
Radiation
think I
people
don't
go
believe
the
you. I
wrong
think you're.
direction with radiation.
I think you're intentionally now backtracking on what you said, because you said earlier that one of the good things that happened was it increased our military readiness because this
Yes.
situation. Okay, now you're
That
saying
is a
it would
good
have.
thing.
Now you're saying it would have happened anyways.
Yeah,
Okay,
it would
well, then that
happen
hardly
later on.
seems to like that's like
It would have
then it
taken
hardly
more
seems
time
as a
for that
reason to say
happen.
that you support the war. It's like this thing happened that was going to happen anyways. Then that's not a reason to support the war. Secondly, right, just because this might be on scale different than what we've had, we've certainly provided weapons or sold weapons, older weapons, thereby making us buy new weapons
Not true.
many times. For example, that's exactly what we're doing in Saudi Arabia right now. We're selling them weapons that they're then using in Yemen. We've done this to countries all through Africa and other places. Thirdly, these same organizations, I don't know if you remember this, even though Trump did bomb Syria and I heavily criticized for him, Trump was the first president basically in my lifetime to not have an actual new war that he got involved in. And so the idea that, like, well, it can't be that companies like Raytheon are successful in their lobbying efforts to facilitate increased military action because it means more munitions have to be purchased from them. And the other thing that I wanted to say is you've basically conceded that it works. You said, there are two parts of this. Part A, you said, of course, they are successful in their lobbying efforts, at least at times. And second, you said, and of course, what they're going to be lobbying for is to make policies that make them more money. And you've conceded that sending this money and keeping this war going keeps them making more money. And so if we're interested in stopping signals for bad things that lead to conflict, I think that that is a far more important signal to stop, seeing as how the vast amount of military engagements the United States has been involved with, the majority of them, I think, have been untoward, and they've been supported and made money for companies like Raytheon over and over again. I think that's a more important signal to stop than, well, there's been 50 examples of bullying by countries that we consider bullying in the past decade, but we need to stop just this one. It's very important, even if it increases the chance of World War III, that we step up to the plate now. Not that we did it with Yemen, not that we did it with Libya, not that we do it with Syria, but this one time it's very important because we have to.
And
this is the
again,
only
I
time we
never
could have
said
set
that
this.
we shouldn't have stepped up to the plate on those actions.
But it
either.
doesn't. Okay, let me say
We
this, right?
should have.
If
I have the same position on those actions as I do on Ukraine.
You're missing my point, and you're missing my point, and it's probably my fault, right? Let's say hypothetically that there were 49 examples of the bullying you're talking about that occurred in the last 10 years. Just hypothetically, okay? Got it?
Okay.
Then there's this situation. Now, the fact that we didn't stop those 49 previous, but we're going to stop this one, is that enough to deter future bullying efforts?
No, but you got to start somewhere.
So then you're literally willing to take a... Wait a minute.
Take a stand and do that.
Okay, how about this? How about we do this, right?
Just because we didn't do it before doesn't mean we shouldn't do it now.
How about next time a small country bullies, we start there and then try to avoid a chance of nuclear war in World War III? How about that?
Again, by not standing up to them, you're incentivizing other countries to proliferate nuclear weapons and
doesn't matter. Next time, you already said they're going to do it anyways. This one time wouldn't be enough to stop it. And if we have to start if we have to start somewhere, and it's like in this situation, which could possibly lead to a nuclear war, or a situation where Sri Lanka does something shitty 3 months down the road and we stop that bullying there. Okay, we started it at this different area a couple months later. But we avoided a risk of nuclear war. That sounds good to me. Why not?
If you go back to when we started down the road of the bullying thing, I said specifically that we cannot allow a country with nuclear weapons to act as a bully on the world scene.
So we can allow countries without nuclear weapons to act as bullies on the world scene.
Much more easily, yes.
How so? That would seem to be
by not standing up to the countries with nuclear weapons It is incentivizing other countries to get nuclear weapons or to threaten the use of those nuclear weapons to enforce their will on other countries.
It's
Okay,
counterintuitive.
let me hop in here. We've been going for 3.5 hours now. I think both of you have made your positions and your thought processes pretty darn clear. At this point, I'm going to ask the chat for any final wrap-up questions. If there's any final wrap-up questions that aren't beating a dead horse, we'll address them quickly. And I'd like to get closing statements from both of you, and then we'll close it up. Let me.
You want to wait?
Well, I'll. Okay, even. Rob, I'm going to get your closing statement first. The chat will proliferate questions as it goes.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, in summation, there are two separate things going on here. There are sort of the
You got 3 minutes, by the way.
Okay. There are the philosophical disagreements that we as individuals are having. By the way, I thank all the moderators. Twisted, I thank you for being here. I thought it was a pleasant conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was a good time. So, there's the philosophical way, right? So we're saying, well, what percentage of nuclear war and things like that? And I'm sorry to say, I think Twisted, his philosophy here is incredibly dangerous, like accepting 30% chances of nuclear war, an attempt to stop bullying and things like that, and other things that we've talked about. But on the level of the practical application, I think that it's, very troubling when we admit that both sides are engaged in propaganda, that the United States has engaged in corruption in the past, that they're most out lying now. I think that all of that basically goes conceded or agreed upon, and that makes it very difficult to trust the actions that the United States are taking here. I think that the appropriate action would have been to do our best to, one, not provoke an escalation from Russia in the first place by intentionally surrounding them, having things like these labs, having sort of revolutions that we supported, like that ousted a friendly president, Yanukovych, to install a puppet of the United States, bombing friendly nations like Assad and Syria. I think this predictably led to Russia escalating, and I had been predicting that when I debated people like Dylan Burns for 3 years or so now. I'd said that eventually Russia is going to strike back. Doesn't mean that I favor Russia. I wish that they would lose immediately, so I'm not some pro-Putin stan or anything like that. But given the fact that this occurred, I think the next best step would have been to approach a peaceful resolution as quickly as possible. That didn't happen, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't start now. As long as we continue to fund this, it's going to be poor people and working class people in places like Ukraine, Russia, and the United States, NATO countries that pay the price. It's going to be people not being able to afford energy in places like Germany. It's going to be people not being able to afford the devaluation of the dollar in places like the United States. They're always the people that sacrifice. Meanwhile, the wealthy elites, once more, are the ones that are going to be having policies that allow them to have more authoritarianism, having economic boons from this. And once more, we're being told, but this time they're right. This time it's morally justified. This time it'll be better for you. It's a lie, just like it was a lie in Libya. It's a lie like it was a lie in Afghanistan. It's a lie like it was a lie in Syria. It's a lie like it was in Vietnam. It's over and over. Fool me once, shame on you. And so I say that we should be doing our best to approach this with a peaceful resolution. It doesn't mean that it'll end up all gravy. I'm not saying that, but that is the best possible solution. I think that war should be a last recourse, and unfortunately, we've allowed the corrupt people that control our country to push for that over and over and over. And remember, this is one of the biggest reasons that they went after Donald Trump. Chuck Schumer, the opposition leader, told us that Trump, the elected leader, the most powerful elected leader in the world, had to be fearful of the intelligence agencies because they'd find 6 ways Sunday at getting back in, which they did. They engaged in a coup against him. And what was his big sin? Well, he just paid lip service to ending the forever war state, the regime change war state. And that is a sin that is unforgivable, even with the establishment rhinos. So I say now is the time to send that signal to stop these corrupt actions and to start ending this corruption and get a government that works for our people and does not intentionally cause harm around the world.
Okay, with those last, you got a few seconds left on the clock. I'm going to pose a question from chat to you. At this point, why shouldn't we go all in and end the Ukraine thing with just overpowering Russia? I'm going to give you like 30 seconds for that.
They'd nuke us.
Oh, okay. All right, Twisted, you got 3 minutes on the clock, sir. Let's close your statement.
Well, I'm not big on the whole politics and domestic politics and all the, Trump and all that stuff. So I'm not even going to get into corruption and all that stuff. I'm simply going to close on the military strategic point that Russia wants its choke points. Granted, there are probably other reasons as well. Russia wants its choke points. We can't allow that to happen. And we also have to stand up to the nuclear bully. We can't allow other nations to develop the thought in their head that just because we have nuclear weapons now, we can do whatever we want on the world scene, and nobody's going to stop us. We have to draw the line somewhere. And unfortunately, I don't want to draw the line right now, but we have to. Sometimes you're forced, your hand is forced, you're forced to do something you don't want to do. Just like we did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We drew a line with the Soviet Union and said, no, this is not going to happen. We are doing that now with Russia, and we need to keep doing that.
And you see the rest of your time?
Yeah.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I think this has been one hell of a conversation. Got a little bit heated at times, and
No, I think it was totally respectful.
Yeah, me too. I enjoyed it.
oh, I
thought
said
this was a good
heated. I
talk.
didn't say rude or disrespectful. I said heated.
Oh, usually people talk about heated being. Yeah.
Very good debate.
Yeah, it's no fun if it's not heated.
Conversation.
No,
It was a very
no,
good
it was
conversation.
it was high
Nothing
energy. It was passionate, heated. But yes, it was respectful.
Here's what. Let's not all be nice. Fuck that Grumple guy, right? Like, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. He's not here. Fuck him. Yeah.
We love Grumple.
We love our group.
He's
No,
just
he was
he's
fine,
just a
yeah.
little bit rogue.